Some nights begin not with noise, but with silence so deep it feels alive. That's how the story of this party began. Not with chaos, but with a hush, a waiting, a breath before laughter. And before I share it with you, I want you to know something simple and true. We love you and we care for you. You belong here in this moment with us. So before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now take your coffee or maybe tea and settle in. Let your body soften and your mind rest. Let's begin. Some nights begin not with motion but with stillness so deep it feels alive. The Smith home sat in that kind of stillness, as though the walls themselves were breathing slowly, waiting for something unnamed. The air was heavy but not unkind. It was the kind of weight that comes when a house is holding its family close, wrapping them in a hush. Outside, the world went about its restless turning, but here inside time slowed, softened, and folded upon itself. Rick lingered in the kitchen, a silhouette against dim light, his hands moving without rush as he tinkered with some small device only he understood. The faint smell of metal and faint ozone clung to him, and yet his presence, chaotic though it often was, carried a strange comfort. He was like a storm that had paused for a moment, choosing stillness over thunder. The clink of glass and the tiny sparks from his invention flickered against the silence like whispers, too shy to speak aloud. Morty shifted restlessly in the living room, glancing at his grandfather from time to time. He could never fully relax when Rick was near. The old man's mind was always spinning, always a few steps ahead, pulling Morty into places he didn't fully understand. And yet, beneath the nervousness, Morty felt a strange safety too. Rick's wildness meant that something unusual was always just a breath away, and though that thought unsettled him, it also called to him like a quiet drumbeat. The Smith house itself seemed to share Morty's anticipation. Shadows stretched across the walls like old memories. The clock ticked, steady and patient, but every second felt as if it were leading somewhere. The furniture held its posture politely, lamps cast their pale glow, and the floor beneath their feet hummed faintly, as though alive with the weight of unspoken possibility. It was the kind of night when even silence felt like a prelude. Morty leaned back into the couch cushions, his fingers tapping against the fabric. His parents had not yet left, but already he could feel their absence curling at the edges of the house, like fog seeping in before dawn. Beth's careful presence and Jerry's uncertain warmth often anchored the family in their own clumsy way, and without them, the house seemed to teeter on a balance between order and unraveling. Morty didn't know what was coming, but something in his chest told him this night would not end as it began. Rick glanced at Morty without lifting his head, his eyes half hidden beneath his brow. For all his strange brilliance, Rick carried a weight inside him that Morty often sensed but could not name. There was loneliness in him, hidden beneath jokes and belches, a kind of quiet ache that only revealed itself in pauses like this. Tonight, in the hush before anything had begun, Morty felt that ache more clearly than usual. The television murmured in the background, its low glow washing the walls in soft blue, but even its voices seemed muted, swallowed by the thick air of waiting. Summer padded through the hall, her phone glowing in her hand, her expression bright with thoughts Morty could not read. She seemed less weighed down than he was, more eager to lean into whatever the night might offer. Where Morty hesitated, Summer often surged forward. That balance, his quiet unease and her glowing certainty, was part of what made their sibling bond quietly beautiful. Rick coughed, adjusted a dial on his gadget, and let it rest on the table with a clatter louder than the room seemed able to contain. The sound echoed briefly before dissolving, as if swallowed whole. "Morty," he muttered softly, his tone neither harsh nor kind, but something in between, like someone waking from a dream. Morty looked up, startled, but Rick didn't continue. Instead, he leaned back into his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, as though listening to something deeper than the hum of the room. And perhaps he was. For Rick, silence was never just silence. It was a canvas for the galaxies whirring in his mind. For Morty, it was the weight of possibility pressing on his chest. For the Smith house, it was the breath before laughter, before chaos, before something neither gentle nor violent, but strangely necessary. The night outside stretched on, vast and velvet. Stars leaned close through the window, shimmering faintly as though curious about the lives unfolding beneath them. A cool breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and grass. the reminder that even in moments of stillness, the world continued its endless turning. Morty sighed and pulled a blanket across his lap, though he wasn't cold. He felt small in the quiet, like a boy perched at the edge of something larger than himself. He thought about the last time the house had been this still. It had been weeks ago, maybe months, and yet he remembered it vividly. The way Summer had hummed a song under her breath. The way Beth had set her glass down on the counter. The way Rick had stared out the window as if looking for something he had lost long ago. And now, here it was again, that same stillness repeating itself, looping back like a lullaby that never fully leaves you. Morty wondered if nights like this always came before something strange. He wondered if Rick knew, if Rick could feel the weight of what was about to begin. Rick finally opened his eyes, and for a brief moment, Morty thought he saw a softness there, as though the old man was remembering something too. But just as quickly it vanished, hidden behind a smirk and a muttered word Morty couldn't catch. The gadget on the table pulsed once with faint light, and then went dark again. The house inhaled. The silence deepened, and the night, the long waiting night, stretched its arms wide. Somewhere in the distance, faint and far, the world moved on. But here in this quiet house something was beginning. The Smith home had always carried its share of noises. The hum of Beth's hurried footsteps before work, Jerry's gentle stammering as he searched for words, the clink of plates and glasses, the rustle of Summer's laughter spilling down the hall. But tonight, one by one, those sounds faded. They were not taken away all at once, but slowly, carefully, like candles being pinched out until only smoke remained. Beth and Jerry were leaving. Not far, not forever, only on a short trip. Yet the house, as though it had its own listening heart, began to notice the absence before the front door even closed. Their luggage wheels whispered against the floor. Their voices called out reminders into the silence, and then with the soft pull of a door, the sound of them dissolved into the night air outside. Morty stood at the top of the stairs watching them go. He wasn't sure why his chest tightened when he saw his parents step into the car, Jerry fumbling with the seatbelt, Beth already half focused on the road ahead. They would return, of course. Parents always did, or at least they tried. But in that moment, as the taillights shimmered red against the driveway and vanished into the dark, Morty felt something shift inside him. The house felt too large without them. Each room seemed to stretch just a little wider, each shadow to lean a little longer. The familiar warmth of his mother's presence and his father's bumbling chatter had always been background music, sometimes annoying, sometimes overlooked, but now in their absence, the silence sang louder than any noise could. Summer emerged from her room, phone in hand, her glow bright and alive. She didn't seem as affected. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the freedom, the loosening of rules that came with being left behind. Her hair caught the dim light as she walked past Morty, and she gave him a small smirk. "Don't look so gloomy," she said softly, though her voice too seemed to vanish quickly into the quiet. Morty nodded, though the heaviness stayed. He couldn't explain to her that it wasn't worry exactly. It was something gentler, stranger, the way an empty chair can remind you of the person who once sat there, or the way an untouched sandwich on the counter can feel like a message. The absence itself was alive. It filled the air in invisible ways. Rick was in the garage, tinkering as always. He didn't seem to notice Beth and Jerry's departure, or perhaps he noticed more deeply than anyone else. For Rick, absence was an old friend, one that had walked beside him across galaxies and lifetimes. If he felt it now, he didn't show it. His mutterings carried through the open door, scraps of strange words and half-laughed sentences, like smoke drifting into the still air of the house. Morty lingered at the window after his parents left. He pressed his palm against the glass, the coolness of it grounding him. The driveway was empty now, and the street outside stretched quiet and endless, a thin ribbon of asphalt under starlight. He thought about how many times he had watched them drive away before, how many times he had waited for the headlights to return. But tonight felt different. The silence had a deeper texture, a weight that seemed to press against his ribs. The Smith home absorbed it all. The chairs stood solemn. The dishes in the sink glinted faintly. The couch cushions sighed as though relieved of duty. Each object carried memory, and with Beth and Jerry gone, those memories swelled. Morty thought he could almost hear echoes, his mother's voice calling his name, his father laughing at a joke no one else understood. They were not truly gone, but their absence had a presence of its own, and the house held it like a lullaby. Summer plopped down on the couch beside him, scrolling on her phone, the glow lighting her face. "It's not a big deal," she murmured, though she didn't look at him. "They'll be back. It's just a weekend." Her words were true, and yet they did nothing to thin the silence. If anything, they only made it thicker. Morty glanced at her, then at Rick's shadow in the garage. The three of them were together, yet each was wrapped in their own world. The absence of Beth and Jerry seemed to spread them further apart and bind them closer all at once, a paradox only silence could hold. Rick finally emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes glinting in the low light. "They're gone," he muttered, not as a question but as a statement. His tone was almost indifferent, but Morty caught a flicker, a faint shift like a man who had once seen too many people leave. Rick didn't dwell on it, though. He never did. He simply dropped the rag on the counter, reached for a flask and sat down heavily in his chair. The clock ticked. The house seemed to lean into its emptiness. Morty curled deeper into the couch, pulling the blanket closer. The silence was no longer frightening, but it wasn't comforting either. It was something in between, something that asked him to notice it, to sit with it, to learn from it. He felt small in it, but also strangely awake. Summer laughed suddenly at something on her phone, her voice breaking through like a bell, reminding Morty that life still hummed, even in absence. Rick burped, muttered something about wasted space, and began to fiddle with another gadget. The house, though hollow, began to feel less lonely. Absence had made itself known, but now it began to weave itself into presence. Morty let his eyes wander to the window again, where the stars leaned close. They seemed to shimmer more brightly now, as if to fill the gaps left behind. He wondered if absence was always meant to be this way, not an end but an opening, a gentle space for something else to come. The Smith home sighed, a quiet exhale. The night deepened, wrapping the family in its hush, and though Beth and Jerry were gone, the house was not empty. It was waiting. The house had not yet grown used to its new quiet. It lingered in the corners, a hush that seemed to wait for someone to break it. Summer had retreated to her room, her music playing faintly through the walls, more like a heartbeat than a song. Morty lingered in the living room, pulling the blanket tighter, staring into the dim glow of the lamp as though it might answer his restlessness. It was Rick, of course, who noticed the quiet most differently. He sat in his chair, flask in hand, tools scattered on the table before him. He didn't look restless. He looked mischievous, like someone who had lived long enough to know that silence could be bent, reshaped, made into something unexpected. He let the hush settle for a while as though tasting it, and then he chuckled softly to himself, a low, gravelly sound that carried more warmth than he'd ever admit. "Morty," he said, almost tenderly, though his words were wrapped in that familiar roughness. "You feel it, don't you? The emptiness, the hole where noise used to be." Morty turned his head, blinking at his grandfather. Yeah, I guess. It just feels weird. Like the house is too big without Mom and Dad here." Rick nodded, swirling the liquid in his flask. "That's the thing about empty spaces, Morty. People try to fill them with noise, with junk, with distractions. But sometimes—" He leaned back, eyes half-lidded, a ghost of a grin tugging at his mouth. Sometimes they're waiting for something else. Something different." Morty frowned, not entirely sure what Rick meant. But before he could ask, Rick stood with a suddenness that startled him. He shuffled toward the garage, muttering to himself, and Morty felt the weight of curiosity tugging at him. He rose from the couch and followed. The garage smelled of oil, dust, and strange chemicals, like a place between worlds. Rick's hands moved quickly over the cluttered workbench, pushing aside scraps of metal and tubing until he unearthed a device Morty hadn't seen before. A small, humming cube that pulsed with soft blue light. "What's that?" Morty asked, his voice small but edged with interest. Rick glanced at him, his grin widening. "This, Morty, is a little amplifier. A resonance shifter, you could say. It can turn stillness into vibration, silence into music, empty space into something else." He tapped it lightly, and the cube glowed brighter, its hum deepening. Morty tilted his head. "So, what are you saying?" Rick's eyes sparkled, though there was an unusual softness in them. I'm saying, Morty, why let a house sit quiet and sad when you can let it breathe? Why not take all that absence and bend it, make it into something fun? He leaned closer, his voice lowering into something almost conspiratorial. Morty, how about a little party? Morty's stomach tightened. The word party brought a mix of feelings, excitement, fear, and the strange sense that something was about to change. A party? Like here? But Mom and Dad, they'll never know. Rick interrupted gently, waving a hand. And even if they did, it's not about them, Morty. It's about us. About you. About filling the silence with something that makes your heart beat a little faster. The cube pulsed again as if agreeing. Morty stared at it, uncertain. He thought of the house upstairs, empty and waiting. He thought of the way the silence had pressed against him, how it had felt both heavy and lonely. Maybe a party could change that. Maybe it could turn the absence into something else. Not chaos, not fear, but life. Rick seemed to read his hesitation. He softened his voice, something rare in his tone. Don't think of it as a wild thing, Morty. Think of it as a gathering. A chance to let the house remember what it feels like to hold warmth and color. Nothing flashy, just a gentle mischief, Morty swallowed. A part of him wanted to say no, to retreat back to the couch and let the night pass quietly. But another part, the part that had been stirring ever since the taillights of his parents' car vanished into the night, wanted to say yes. Wanted to step into something new. Summer's footsteps creaked down the stairs then, her music silenced, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What are you two whispering about?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with interest. Rick smirked, gesturing toward the cube. "How do you feel about a gathering? Something to keep the silence from swallowing us whole." Summer's eyes lit up almost immediately. She had no hesitation, no doubts. "Finally," she said, laughing softly. "This place could use a little life." Morty looked between them, Rick with his strange tenderness, Summer with her easy confidence, and felt the silence around them shift. It was as though the house itself had leaned closer, listening, waiting for the answer. He took a deep breath. "Okay," he whispered, surprising himself. "Let's do it. Let's have a party." Rick's grin spread, not manic but warm, as though he had been hoping Morty would say that. He pressed a button on the cube, and it vibrated softly, sending a ripple through the air. Morty swore the garage walls themselves seemed to hum, as though they too were waiting for the night to come alive. The house was no longer hollow. It was pregnant with possibility, brimming with the gentle mischief Rick had planted. The silence that had once felt heavy now felt like a stage, waiting for its first notes. Rick patted Morty's shoulder, clumsy but real. "Good choice, Morty. Sometimes mischief is just another way of remembering you're alive." Morty didn't fully understand, but he felt lighter somehow. The hush of absence was fading, and in its place a quiet anticipation grew. Upstairs the lights flickered faintly, as though even the walls were preparing. The night stretched out ahead, and the first hints of change whispered through it. The house had been waiting, and now it knew something was coming. The decision had been made, though it was not shouted or celebrated. It slipped into the air like a secret, quiet but firm, and the house seemed to shift around it. Rick's cube hummed faintly from the garage, its glow softening into the walls like moonlight seeping through blinds. Summer was already buzzing with energy, her laughter drifting up the staircase as she began to imagine what the night might bring. Rick, as always, retreated into his own half-muttered tasks, though there was a flicker in his eyes that gave away the spark he had lit. It was Morty who lingered in the doorway, caught between stillness and movement. His heart was restless, his thoughts scattered like papers in a breeze. He had agreed to the party, the word had left his lips, but the reality of it settled heavier now. The silence was no longer hollow. It was waiting, and waiting made him uneasy. He drifted into the living room, pulling the blanket around his shoulders as though it could anchor him. The lamp beside the couch still glowed, steady and warm, casting soft light on the walls. Morty sat there for a moment, listening. The house was alive with anticipation, and yet it was still so quiet that he could hear the ticking of the clock. His stomach twisted. He imagined the house filling with people, strangers, creatures from other worlds, faces he couldn't quite picture but felt certain would come. He imagined voices overlapping, music echoing through the hallways. The still air transformed into something bright and moving. And with the image came a knot of nerves, What if nobody likes me? Morty whispered to himself, a thought that had lingered for years. Stumbling over words, saying something foolish, and watching others laugh. The picture made his throat tighten. He pulled the blanket tighter, rocking slightly. And yet, another picture came. One softer, slower. He saw himself standing in the corner of a room, a cup in hand, listening as voices filled the space. He saw himself smiling. Not a big, forced grin, but a small one. Almost shy, a curve of the lips that said, "I'm here. And I belong." The image warmed him. Rick entered suddenly, carrying a strange device that buzzed faintly. He looked at Morty with a glance that was sharp and knowing, though softened by something he wouldn't name. "You're chewing on it, huh?" he asked. "The what-ifs, the nerves, the whole Morty special." Morty blinked, flustered. "I don't know, I don't know if I can, be part of all this. A party, I mean. I'm not like Summer. I'm not even like you." Rick sighed, plopping down into the chair opposite him. He took a swig from his flask, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then spoke with a surprising gentleness. "Morty, parties aren't about being the loudest or the brightest. They're about showing up. That's it. You show up, you take a breath, you let yourself exist in the middle of other people existing. Sometimes you talk, sometimes you just listen. Either way, you're part of it." Morty stared at him, uncertain. "But what if I mess it up?" Rick chuckled, though it wasn't mocking. It was low, almost fond. "Then you mess it up. Everyone does. You spill a drink, you say something weird, you trip on a rug. Congratulations, you're human. The trick, Morty, is to smile through it. Even if it's just a little one. A hesitant smile goes a long way." The words lingered. Morty thought of that small smile again, the one that had flickered in his imagination. He touched his lips, almost as if testing the shape of it. It felt strange, but not impossible. Summer's footsteps echoed on the stairs, breaking the quiet. She appeared in the doorway, eyes bright, phone still in hand. "I sent out a few messages," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "People are coming." Morty's stomach flipped, but Rick only smirked. "Good. Let the house breathe." Summer crossed the room, ruffling Morty's hair as she passed. "Don't look so worried, little bro. It'll be fun. You might even talk to someone." Her tone was playful, but beneath it was something softer, encouragement, even faith. Morty caught it, and though it embarrassed him, it also warmed him. He pulled the blanket tighter and let himself lean back. The image of the party grew clearer now, and though the nerves didn't vanish, they softened around the edges. He could almost feel it, the hum of voices, the warmth of bodies moving. The way laughter could fill the hollow spaces. Rick tapped the cube with his knuckle, and it pulsed brighter, sending a faint vibration through the floor. "It's starting," he muttered. "Not the party yet, but the rhythm. Every gathering has a rhythm, Morty. You'll find yours." Morty didn't fully understand, but the words nestled into him like seeds. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he caught his reflection faintly in the window. His lips curved upward, small and shaky, but real. A hesitant smile. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It wasn't boldness. Not like Summer's glow or Rick's strange bravado. It was something quieter, something delicate, but it was his, a beginning. The night stretched out before them, long and full of unknown shapes. Morty let the smile linger, even as nerves fluttered in his chest. For the first time, he felt like maybe the silence wasn't waiting to swallow him. Maybe it was waiting for him to step inside, hesitant but present, and bring his own small warmth. Rick raised his flask slightly, as though in a toast. "There it is, Morty," he said softly, almost to himself. "That's the smile. That's how it starts." The cube glowed brighter, the house exhaled, and the night leaned closer. The hum of Rick's cube lingered like a heartbeat, soft and steady, filling the Smith home with a sense of anticipation. The silence of the house, once heavy and hollow, was now bending, reshaping itself into something expectant. Morty sat on the couch with the blanket still wrapped around him, his hesitant smile fading in and out like a candle flame in a draught. Summer paced, restless and excited, her phone glowing in her hand. Rick, meanwhile, leaned against the doorway, flask in hand, eyes half closed, as though listening to a song no one else could hear. Then, gently, it began. The first knock wasn't loud. It was almost polite, like the brush of a hand against wood. Morty startled, heart skipping, but Summer lit up instantly, darting to the door. When she opened it, the world seemed to spill in. The first guests were not like neighbors or classmates. They came from somewhere stranger, somewhere softer. A tall figure with skin that shimmered like liquid glass stepped inside, their body bending light into soft colors that danced across the walls. Beside them drifted a being no taller than Morty's shoulder, wrapped in a cloak of starlight, their eyes glowing faintly like lanterns in fog. Morty's breath caught. They weren't frightening, not exactly. They felt dreamlike, as though they belonged less to the world outside and more to the spaces between thoughts. "Whoa," Summer whispered, her eyes wide but thrilled. That's amazing." The guests moved with grace, as though they understood they were stepping into something delicate. The tall one bowed faintly, the glass of their skin catching the lamplight. The smaller one tilted their head toward Morty. And though they said nothing, Morty felt acknowledged, seen, as if someone had pressed a gentle hand against his shoulder. Rick smirked, muttering right on time before taking a swig from his flask. His voice held no surprise, as if he had expected these beings, perhaps even invited them. More footsteps followed. The next to arrive was a pair, a man and woman or something like it, though their faces flickered, shifting through dozens of expressions every few seconds. Smiles, frowns, laughter, tears, all flowed across their features in seamless rhythm, like waves breaking against a shore. Their presence was strange, but it carried no menace. If anything, it felt like honesty, the visible ebb and flow of emotion. Summer clapped her hands together, laughing softly. "This is insane, like a dream you don't want to wake up from." Morty stayed quiet, but his eyes widened with wonder. He thought about his earlier fear, his doubts about fitting in, and realized something unexpected. These guests, with their shimmering skin and flickering faces, didn't make him feel smaller. If anything, they made the house feel fuller, warmer. The strangeness wasn't overwhelming. It was beautiful. The living room filled slowly. Each new guest brought a different kind of presence, a tall feathered figure whose wings brushed softly against the ceiling, leaving faint trails of golden dust in the air. A being who seemed carved from wood, their voice creaking gently like trees in the wind as they greeted the others. A trio of tiny glowing creatures who zipped through the room like fireflies, giggling in a language no one could quite understand. Morty sat forward, his nerves mingling with awe. He expected chaos, noise, something overwhelming. Instead, the arrivals felt like brushstrokes on a canvas, each one adding color and texture without disturbing the harmony of the whole. The house wasn't crowded. It was breathing, expanding, as though it had been waiting all along for this chorus of beings to enter. Rick drifted toward Morty, watching him closely. "Not so bad, huh?" he said softly, his voice carrying that rare edge of warmth. Morty swallowed, nodding. "They're different, but they don't feel scary. It's more like—" He struggled for the word, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "They're like they belong here. Like the house was empty just so they could come in." Rick chuckled, patting Morty's shoulder clumsily. "That's the spirit. Sometimes strangeness is just another way of saying new." Summer floated around the room like she was born for this, introducing herself to every guest, laughing easily, her glow bright and magnetic. Morty watched her, half admiring, half envious. She seemed untouched by nerves, moving from one conversation to the next as though she had always known how. But when she glanced at Morty from across the room and gave him a small nod, he felt something shift inside him. She hadn't forgotten him. She saw him too. More guests came. A musician carrying an instrument shaped like a crescent moon, whose strings glowed when touched. Their first notes filled the air with soft music, gentle and otherworldly, like rain falling on glass. The sound threaded through the house, weaving itself around conversations and laughter, making the walls hum with life. Morty felt his shoulders loosen. The music, the voices, the colors, they wrapped around him like a blanket, easing the tightness in his chest. He didn't speak much, not yet, but he let himself smile again, hesitant but real. The house had transformed. Where once there had been silence, now there was gentle motion. Laughter rose, not harsh but tender. Conversations drifted like whispers carried by the wind. Light shimmered against the walls, shadows dancing in rhythm with the music. Rick leaned against the wall, watching it unfold. For all his cynicism, his eyes softened as he took in the sight of his family within this gathering. He said nothing, But Morty caught the look, and for a moment he wondered if this was what Rick wanted all along. Not chaos, but memory. As the night deepened, Morty rose from the couch. His legs trembled slightly, but he stood anyway, stepping toward the center of the room where the guests mingled. No one turned to judge him. No one laughed at his awkwardness. Instead, a small glowing creature darted past and paused, hovering in front of his face before giggling softly and darting away again. Morty laughed, a nervous, quiet sound, but laughter all the same. It was a beginning. His beginning. The Smith home, once hollow, was now alive with dreamlike color and sound. And Morty, though still hesitant, was learning to smile in the middle of it. The first guests had arrived. The night was only just beginning. The music lingered in the air like a soft perfume, delicate but steady, curling into every corner of the Smith home. The walls, which only hours ago had absorbed silence, now reflected laughter and drifting voices like ripples on water. Strange beings filled the living room and kitchen, luminous, gentle, dreamlike. They weren't loud. They weren't chaotic. They moved as if they understood that the night was not theirs to conquer, but to color. And at the center of it all was Summer. Her glow wasn't literal, not like the guests whose skin shimmered or whose eyes burned like lanterns. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something luminous in her posture, her laughter, her words. She floated from one conversation to another, as though she had done this all her life, her voice weaving into the music, her smile breaking like sunlight through the hush. She spoke with the tall, glass-skinned figure, who bent slightly as though honored by her attention. She laughed with the tiny glowing creatures, holding her hand out so one might land on her palm. She leaned against the counter, hair catching the soft light, while speaking with the musician whose moon-shaped instrument pulsed gently in time with their words. Morty watched from the couch at first, blanket folded neatly at his side now, hands resting nervously on his knees. He couldn't help but notice how easily she belonged. Where he hesitated, she leapt. Where he fumbled for words, she found them waiting on her tongue, yet watching her didn't make him shrink. Not tonight. Something about her confidence felt like a promise instead of a shadow. She wasn't only his older sister. She was someone who knew how to step into a moment and let it unfold around her. And in her glow, Morty began to see possibilities for himself, even if they were only faint outlines. Summer's laughter spilled across the room again, and Morty smiled, small but genuine. He realized that her glow wasn't only for her. It reached out, brushing against those around her, reminding them that they too could shine in their own ways, even him. Rick leaned lazily against the doorframe, flask in hand, watching the scene unfold with a look Morty couldn't quite read. It wasn't pride, not exactly. But there was a softness in his gaze, a recognition. He muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Morty to catch. "Kid knows how to light a room." Morty glanced at him. "You mean Summer?" Rick raised his eyebrows, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Who else, Morty? She's burning bright tonight. Enjoy it while it lasts. Glow like that is rare." Morty nodded, turning his eyes back to her. Summer had caught sight of him then, across the room. Instead of letting him fade into the background, she raised her glass in a playful toast, her smile widening. For just a second, the connection bridged the distance between them, older sister, younger brother, and Morty felt included, even from afar. He lifted his hand awkwardly in return, his cheeks warming. It wasn't much, but it mattered. The party flowed on, gentle as a tide. Summer moved through it, like someone following an invisible rhythm. She asked questions, listened intently, laughed easily, and let her curiosity guide her. Morty realized that her glow came not just from confidence, but from a willingness to meet the strangeness with open arms. She didn't resist the dreamlike guests or shy away from their oddities. She welcomed them as though they had always been part of her world. At one point, she stood with the musician by the window. The strings of their crescent instrument shimmered as Summer tilted her head, speaking softly. The two of them shared a moment, brief but real, and the music that followed carried her laughter inside it. Morty thought it sounded brighter, lighter, as though the strings had absorbed her glow. Summer's eyes occasionally flicked back toward Morty, checking on him without words. It was subtle, but he noticed. Even as she thrived in the center of the gathering, she hadn't forgotten him. That, more than anything, softened the knot in his chest. Rick finally pushed himself off the doorframe, striding toward the kitchen. He grumbled about snacks, rummaging through the cabinets, but Morty caught a trace of pride in the way Rick's eyes lingered on Summer. "She's got that spark," he muttered again, though this time it was to himself. Morty followed him, standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway, watching Summer laugh with a cluster of guests whose faces flickered through countless expressions. The sight made him ache and wonder all at once. "Do you think she's different tonight?" Morty asked softly. Rick smirked, tossing a bag of chips onto the counter. "Everyone's different when the lights hit them just right, Morty. Doesn't mean it's fake. Just means you're seeing another side of them. Summer's glow? It's real. But don't forget, you've got your own way of shining. You just don't know it yet." Morty looked down, his hands fidgeting again. But Rick's words settled into him, slow and steady. Maybe there was room for both kinds of light. Summer's bold glow and his hesitant smile. The night stretched onward. Summer continued to thrive, moving like a current through the gathering, yet every so often she glanced back, making sure her little brother wasn't drifting too far away. Morty felt it, the bond between them, unspoken but alive. She might tease him, might laugh at his awkwardness, but beneath it all she carried him in her glow, pulling him closer into the circle rather than leaving him outside it. As the music swelled again, soft and otherworldly, Summer raised her arms and spun gently, her laughter ringing like chimes. The guests around her clapped softly, their voices blending into the rhythm. For a moment, the room seemed to pulse with her energy. The walls brightened, the air shimmered. She wasn't just a teenager in her parents' house anymore. She was luminous, alive, a dreamer casting sparks into the night. Morty smiled again, hesitant but deeper this time. He wasn't her. He couldn't move with that same ease or laugh with that same fire, but he didn't need to. He could be himself, quiet, thoughtful, unsure, and still be part of the light she spread. Summer's glow carried the night forward. And somewhere inside that glow, Morty began to find his own place, not as an echo, but as a presence all his own. The house breathed with them, alive and gentle. The silence was gone now, replaced with warmth. And in the quiet corners, Morty felt less like an observer and more like someone learning to step into the rhythm, even if only one small step at a time. The Smith home was no longer the same house it had been when the night began. What had once been a shell of silence, familiar in its stillness, had now become something almost alive. The walls seemed to pulse with the low hum of music, the wooden floor faintly vibrating, as if the beams themselves wanted to sway with the rhythm. Rick's inventions had often given life to strange machines, but this was different. The house was not mechanical. It was breathing, slowly, deeply, as if inhaling the voices and laughter that filled its rooms, then exhaling them back into the soft glow of lights strung across the walls. The guests felt it too. They moved through the spaces not like invaders, but like currents of wind carried by the rhythm of the night. Their shapes, unusual as they were, seemed to bend with the living pulse of the home. A tall guest, whose body shimmered like water, leaned against the couch as if it had always belonged there. Another, a small cluster of floating eyes, drifted down the hallway, its motion in sync with the hum of music, and everywhere the Smith family's presence lingered, even in absence. Beth's framed photographs still lined the mantel. Jerry's half-read magazines were stacked on the coffee table. They hadn't disappeared. Instead, they blended with the surreal glow, everyday objects wrapped in dreamlike warmth. The house, in its breathing, seemed to carry both the ordinary and the extraordinary side by side. Morty stood in the kitchen doorway, eyes wide, listening. He swore he could hear it. The soft inhale, the long exhale, the walls gathering the joy of the room and releasing it back, like a lullaby repeated over and over. He wasn't afraid. It was comforting in a strange way, like resting against a heartbeat not his own. Rick noticed his stillness. He walked up behind him, flask in hand, and murmured, "You feel it, huh? The place is alive tonight. Don't think too hard about it, Morty. Just let it carry you." Morty nodded, not trusting his words. He stepped further into the living room, where laughter brushed against him like waves against a shore. Summer was near the couch, still radiant, but even her glow seemed to have softened, merging with the rhythm of the house. She looked less like a fire blazing in the night, and more like a steady lantern guiding it forward. The music shifted, slower now, dreamlike. A soft percussion tapped like a heartbeat, and strings whispered like voices telling secrets. The guests moved in response, some swaying gently, some sitting down as if to listen more closely. The house leaned into the change, its breathing slowing, matching the rhythm. Morty sat at the edge of a chair, his fingers curling against his knees. For once, he didn't feel out of place. The house didn't demand him to be louder, braver, or bolder. It simply welcomed him as he was. Its walls hummed around him, acknowledging his presence, folding him into the living rhythm. Rick drifted toward the far side of the room, watching quietly. His eyes, sharp and restless by habit, softened just slightly as he scanned the scene. He didn't interfere. For once, he allowed the night to unfold without his chaotic touch. Perhaps even he felt the weight of the house's breathing. Summer caught sight of Morty again and crossed the room to him. She leaned down, nudging his shoulder. "It's kind of magical, isn't it?" Morty glanced up at her, uncertain. Yeah, it is. Feels like the house is alive," she smiled. "Maybe it always was. Maybe we just don't listen on normal nights." Her words sank into him, soft as the music. He wondered if she was right, if the house had always carried whispers in its walls, waiting for them to hear. The guests began to settle into smaller clusters, conversations branching like streams from a river. Some spoke in languages Morty couldn't understand, though their tones carried warmth. Others laughed quietly, their gestures gentle, their smiles slow. There was no urgency in the air, only the quiet unfolding of presence. One guest, shaped like a ribbon of light, hovered near Morty, its glow softening as it circled once, then settled beside him. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a reminder that the strange and the familiar could sit side by side without conflict. Summer lingered for a moment, then drifted away again, her confidence pulling her into new conversations. Morty remained in his chair, but he didn't feel left behind. The breathing of the house held him, as if saying, "You are part of this too." In the kitchen, someone had begun to hum, their voice weaving into the music. The hum traveled through the walls, down the hallway, across the living room, until it felt as though the house itself was humming back. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, listening. His chest rose and fell in time with the rhythm, and for the first time that night he felt steady. Rick returned to the couch and lowered himself into the cushions with a sigh. His flask rested loosely in his hand. "Morty," he said softly, surprising the boy, "don't forget this feeling. Nights like this don't last, but the way they breathe through you, that stays." Morty looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice. "Do you really think so?" Rick didn't answer right away. He tipped his head back, staring at the ceiling, as though listening to the heartbeat of the house himself. Then he murmured, "Yeah, Morty, I do." The music lulled, conversations quieted, and for a while the house breathed in near silence, holding them all in its steady rhythm. The night hadn't ended. It was still unfolding. But in that moment, the Smith home was not just walls and furniture. It was a vessel of memory, a keeper of presence, a heart beating softly in the dark. Morty leaned back in his chair, exhaling. His eyes traced the edges of the room, the glow of the lights, the shapes of the guests, and the gentle curve of Summer's smile across the space. He felt the breath of the house flow through him again, and in that exhale he began to belong. The house did not burst into noise all at once. It grew the way tides do, slow and steady, pulling more and more into its rhythm until the water nearly touched the shore of everything around it. At first, the living room seemed full enough, voices weaving, laughter rising, the hum of music carrying through the air. But then the door opened again and another group of guests arrived, followed by another and then another, each carrying their own strange shape and gentle presence. The home stretched to hold them, as though its walls were wider than they looked, as though silence itself had stepped aside to make room. Morty stood near the hallway, wide-eyed. The tide of bodies and colors was swelling, but it wasn't harsh. It was like watching a river rise, carrying driftwood, leaves, and sparks of light. Each guest entered without demand, folding themselves into the rhythm of the house's breathing. The music swelled too, shifting to match the growth, a little louder, a little more layered, but never overwhelming. In the corner, Summer spun with delight. She welcomed each new arrival, as if she had been waiting just for them. Her glow hadn't dimmed. It had grown, her laughter sparking like light skipping across water. She was luminous in the tide, fearless and free, her voice carrying warmth into every cluster of conversation. Rick leaned against the kitchen doorway, flask raised loosely in one hand, watching it all with a quiet smirk. "See, Morty?" he murmured, his eyes on the rising tide. "This isn't destruction. This is expansion. A party doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes bigger." Morty nodded faintly, though his chest still fluttered with nerves. He felt like a small boat in a swelling sea, bobbing in currents he didn't yet know how to ride. But even so, he wasn't drowning. Not yet. The guests filled the living room, spilling into the kitchen, drifting down the hallway, their laughter and whispers bouncing off the walls like echoes. Strange figures with glowing skin mingled with feathered beings who left faint trails of dust behind them. A cluster of tiny, luminous shapes floated near the ceiling, giggling like wind chimes. The tide was rising, and the Smith home absorbed it all. Morty watched one guest, tall, cloaked in shadows, bend low to pick up one of Jerry's forgotten magazines. They flipped it open, their dark fingers tracing the page, eyes glowing faintly as though absorbing every word. It was surreal yet oddly tender to see the ordinary objects of his father's carelessness suddenly honored by something so otherworldly. At the table, another guest, their body shifting like smoke, tapped softly on the wood as if playing an invisible piano. The sound blended with the music, subtle but steady, adding depth to the rhythm already filling the air. Each new voice, each new gesture wasn't an interruption. It was part of the tide. Morty drifted further into the living room, nervous but curious. He brushed past a guest who smelled faintly of lavender and static electricity. They smiled at him, and though their face was difficult to read, Morty felt warmth in the gesture. He nodded back, shy but genuine, and found himself standing a little taller afterward. The tide kept rising. Conversations grew louder, laughter rippling from corner to corner. Glasses clinked as Rick pulled out bottles from nowhere, offering strange drinks that glowed faintly blue. Summer raised hers high, her voice ringing out, "To the night," and for a moment all the voices echoed hers, the house vibrating with the wave of sound. But even in the swell there was no chaos. The rising tide carried a softness with it. The house, still breathing, seemed to know how much it could hold. Each sound blended into the whole, each gesture folding into the living rhythm. It was not overwhelming. It was simply abundant. Morty found himself at the edge of the couch, where two guests spoke quietly in a language he didn't know. Their voices sounded like rainfall against leaves, soft and soothing. He didn't interrupt. He only listened, letting the cadence settle over him like a lullaby. His nerves eased with every word. Rick caught his gaze across the room and gave him the faintest nod, as though approving of his stillness. For Rick, quiet observation was just as much a part of the tide as summer's brightness. Each of them played a role in the balance of the night. The music rose again, now layered with a deeper rhythm. Some guests swayed in place, others clapped softly, their gestures in tune with the flow. Morty tapped his foot without realizing it, his body responding before his mind caught up. Summer darted past him, laughing, a glowing drink in her hand. "Morty, isn't this incredible?" she called, her voice bubbling with joy. Morty hesitated, then nodded, his own smile pulling at his lips. Yeah, it is." She didn't stop, already swept up in the tide, but her words lingered with him. Maybe it was incredible. Maybe he could let it be. The tide carried onward. More guests filled the spaces, their shapes bending against the edges of the home. The walls seemed to stretch, the ceiling to rise, as though the house itself understood how to expand with the abundance. It did not resist. It only welcomed. Morty sat back again, watching it all. The laughter, the movement, the glowing lights. He realized the tide wasn't just about numbers. It was about presence, about every moment layering on the one before it, until the night felt vast and unending. The house breathed deeper now, every inhale drawing the tide closer, every exhale releasing it gently into the air. Morty breathed with it, steadying himself in rhythm. For the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt carried, and in that rising tide of laughter, of color, of voices not his own, he began to find the courage to stay afloat. The tide had risen high, carrying the Smith home into a dreamlike abundance. Laughter curled through the hallways, glasses clinked gently, and music swelled with a steady pulse. Summer's glow was everywhere, radiant, effortless, but Morty lingered near the edges, watching. He wasn't unhappy. He was simply waiting, though he didn't know for what. It began with a small decision. He had been standing by the kitchen doorway, shoulders tucked in, trying to make himself less noticeable. Guests drifted around him like waves, their shapes bending and glowing, voices weaving into songs and whispers. Morty's hands fidgeted in his pockets. His throat felt dry, but his chest pulsed with something quiet, a desire not loud but insistent. He didn't want to only watch. He wanted to step forward, even if just once. The moment came when one of the luminous guests, a ribbon of light shaped like a person, drifted past and paused, turning toward him. Its glow pulsed faintly, as though asking a question without words. Morty's heart thumped. He could have looked away, shrunk back, pretended he didn't notice. But instead, he lifted his hand in a clumsy wave. The guest pulsed brighter, then leaned forward, brushing his arm with its faint glow. It wasn't shocking or frightening. It was warm like sunlight against skin. Morty exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He smiled, shy but genuine, and the guest seemed to shimmer in response before drifting onward. It was small, but it was courage. He stepped further into the living room. His movements were awkward, but no one seemed to mind. The music wrapped around him, coaxing his body into rhythm. He tapped his foot, then let his shoulders move slightly, almost like dancing, but not quite. For Morty, it was enough. Rick watched him from across the room, leaning against the mantel with his flask. His sharp eyes softened briefly, though his mouth curved in the same crooked smirk. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Summer noticed too. She broke off from a glowing cluster of guests and darted toward him, her grin wide. "Morty!" she shouted above the music. "You're actually moving. Look at you!" Morty flushed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I guess. It's not so bad," she laughed, nudging him with her shoulder. "Not so bad? Come on. You're part of this. You don't have to hide in the corners." Her words made something loosen inside him. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to stand at the edges of his own night. The music shifted, carrying a softer melody beneath the steady rhythm. A guest with a crescent moon instrument plucked glowing strings, and the sound drifted through the air like starlight. Conversations slowed and people turned to listen. Morty found himself surrounded by faces he didn't know, shapes he didn't understand. And yet in their quiet attention, he didn't feel judged. He felt included. He dared to speak. Not loudly, not boldly, but enough. He turned to a guest beside him, one who seemed woven from threads of smoke, their face shifting gently as they breathed. "That's really nice music," Morty murmured. The guest's eyes flickered soft and kind. Their smoky form pulsed faintly as though agreeing. They didn't answer in words, but their acknowledgement was enough. Morty's chest swelled. He had spoken. He had been heard. The small courage grew. Later, when the rhythm picked up again, he moved into a group, swaying with the music. He didn't dance like Summer, bold and radiant, but he let himself lean into the motion. His arms moved clumsily, his feet unsure, but he didn't stop. No one laughed. No one pushed him away. Instead, a guest brushed past and gave him a soft nod, their smile glowing faintly. Morty's face burned, but he laughed, and the sound surprised even him. For the first time that night, he felt less like a shadow in his sister's glow and more like a lantern of his own. Smaller, dimmer perhaps, but still burning. Rick wandered over eventually, watching Morty swaying awkwardly among the guests. "Look at you, Morty," he said, voice low but not mocking. "You're blending. You're bending with it. That's the trick, you know. You don't have to fight the tide. You just have to float." Morty glanced at him, breathless from the small effort of movement. Yeah, I think I get it." Rick smirked and took a long pull from his flask. "Don't get used to me being sentimental, Morty, but—" "Good job, kid." The words sank deeper than Morty expected. They weren't loud or dramatic. They were simple, soft, exactly the kind of recognition he had needed. The night carried on, voices rising and falling, the tide of presence swelling further. Summer danced like a flame. Rick drifted like a shadow, and Morty stood somewhere in between, his courage steadying. At one point, he found himself sitting at the edge of the couch, beside a guest with wings folded neatly against their back. They offered him a drink, not glowing like Rick's, just a simple cup of water. Morty accepted it with a quiet thank you. The guest nodded, their golden eyes reflecting the soft lights of the room. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was shared, and it was enough. Morty leaned back, sipping slowly, feeling the rhythm of the house beating in his chest. He realized something then. Courage didn't have to roar. It didn't have to be loud or showy. Sometimes it was just stepping forward once, waving at someone strange or saying a few small words. The house, still breathing, seemed to agree. Its hum wrapped around him like a blanket, steady and warm, whispering, "This is how you grow." Not all at once, but little by little, like ripples spreading outward. Morty smiled to himself, a quiet, almost secret smile. The tide was still rising, but he was no longer afraid of being carried by it. He had found his small courage, and for tonight it was enough. The night was reaching a point where the house seemed fuller than full. Every corner hummed with voices. Every wall glowed with reflected light. Every heartbeat of music carried laughter on its back. Summer was still radiant in the middle of it all, her glow steady as a flame. Morty, braver than before, let himself linger near conversations, stepping forward in ways he never imagined at the beginning of the night. And Rick stood apart, as he always did, yet somehow more present than anyone else in the room. He leaned against the mantel, flask in hand, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He watched the ebb and flow of guests, the way they spoke softly to each other, the way they lingered near Summer's glow, the way Morty's hesitant courage was blooming into something steady. Rick smirked at the sight, but the smirk didn't carry its usual bite. It was softer, tinged with something he rarely allowed anyone to see: tenderness. It wasn't in the way he moved, still restless and fidgeting. It wasn't in his words, which he mostly kept tucked away. It was in his gaze, the way it lingered just long enough on Morty, on Summer, on the house itself, to betray the weight of something deeper. He remembered other nights, other houses, other gatherings where laughter rose and fell like waves, where music stitched moments together. They hadn't ended well. They never did. But still, for a while they had been beautiful. And here he was again, watching his family, fragile, ordinary, extraordinary in their own ways, build something soft and temporary. Rick took a sip from his flask and muttered under his breath, "Don't screw this up, Sanchez." Morty caught sight of him then, hesitating before walking over. His hands fidgeted at his sides, but his steps were steady. He stopped beside Rick, looking up at him with a shy kind of bravery. "Hey, Rick. You okay?" Rick glanced down, surprised for a split second, before masking it with his usual crooked grin. "Of course I am, Morty. Why wouldn't I be? I've got a house full of interdimensional weirdos turning your living room into a cosmic jazz lounge. This is top-tier entertainment." Morty frowned, tilting his head. "I don't know, you look different tonight. Like you're not just making fun of everything." Rick snorted, shaking his head, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he crouched slightly so his face was closer to Morty's and said, "Listen, Morty, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is stop tearing things apart long enough to let them be. That's all I'm doing. Letting it be." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Morty blinked, uncertain what to say, and Rick straightened quickly, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "Don't read too much into it, Morty. It's just a party. Enjoy it while it lasts." But Morty had seen it. The crack in Rick's armor, the faint glimmer of tenderness beneath all the smirks and sarcasm. And somehow it made him feel safer. The music shifted again, slower now, more intimate. A guest with feathered wings spread them wide, the golden dust they shed catching the light as they moved in rhythm with the melody. Conversations quieted. Guests leaned closer to one another, voices soft, almost secret. The house breathed deeply, its rhythm slowing as though it too was listening. Rick lowered himself onto the couch with a sigh, flask balanced loosely in his hand. Summer appeared beside him a moment later, plopping down with glowing cheeks and a grin. "Rick, this is amazing. You're actually, letting us have fun. It's kind of weird." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Weird, kid, this is me being generous. Don't get used to it." But Summer laughed, unconvinced. "Nah, you care. I can see it. You're watching us like it matters to you." Rick rolled his eyes, muttering, "Great, now I've got two of you psychoanalyzing me." Still, he didn't leave. He stayed there beside Summer, watching Morty inch into another small circle of guests, his courage carrying him further than before. Rick's gaze softened again, though he didn't let them notice. Tenderness crept into the night in other ways too. Her guest offered Summer a necklace woven from threads of starlight. She accepted it with awe, pressing it against her chest, her glow brightening further. Morty stumbled through a small conversation with a smoke-formed guest, his words halting but his smile genuine. And Rick, though outwardly aloof, quietly refilled drinks, made space for guests on the couch, and even chuckled once or twice when a glowing creature zipped by with a mischievous squeal. The house carried it all, breathing slower, steadier, as if cradling the night in its rhythm. Rick tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling. For a fleeting second he imagined Beth walking in, Jerry complaining about the noise, the fragile illusion breaking all at once. But then he pushed the thought away. Not yet. Tonight belonged to the soft glow, the laughter, the quiet courage of children who were no longer quite so small. Tenderness wasn't his style. He knew it wouldn't last, but sitting there in the midst of it, he let himself feel it anyway. He whispered something then, so low only the house might have heard. "Don't let them forget this. Don't let them lose it." The words slipped into the hum of the walls, carried away like smoke into air. Morty laughed across the room. Summer leaned her head back against the couch, and Rick's eyes glimmered faintly, though his smirk never left his lips. For one night, just one night, Rick Sanchez allowed himself to care. The music drifted into a lull, as though the night itself had paused to take a breath. The rhythm that had carried everyone forward softened, thinning into quiet notes that barely brushed the air. Conversations slowed, laughter dimmed into murmurs, and the guests seemed to lean inward, not toward the music, but toward each other. It was in these pauses, these fragile silences between songs, that the house felt most alive. Morty stood near the window, his hand brushing the curtain, as if testing the fabric of the world. The stars outside shimmered faintly, their cold light finding its way through the glass to rest on his face. Around him, small groups of guests had settled into corners, their voices lowered, their expressions softened. The wildness of the party had calmed, replaced by a gentler kind of magic, the kind that happens when people stop performing and simply exist together. He listened without meaning to. A being with skin like liquid silver whispered to a guest made entirely of wind, their voices overlapping in tones too soft to catch. Another pair, human enough, sat with knees touching, laughing quietly at something only they understood. Each exchange was fleeting, but each seemed to hold a small universe inside it. Morty exhaled slowly. He felt different in these moments, less clumsy, less uncertain. He wasn't part of every conversation, but he didn't feel left out. Instead, he felt like a witness to something sacred, the in-between, the stillness where honesty lived. Summer was nearby, leaning against the couch arm, a glass of something glowing faintly in her hand. Her laughter had dimmed into a thoughtful quiet. She watched the guests with a kind of wonder, her earlier confidence settling into reflection. When Morty joined her, she didn't speak right away. She just passed him a glance as if to say, "Do you feel it too?" He nodded without words. Rick was in the kitchen, though his voice carried faintly into the living room. He was talking with a creature that seemed to be stitched together from shadows and light, his tone sharp, but his posture relaxed. Even he seemed softened by the pause, his usual edge blunted into something more conversational. He poured drinks with a practiced hand, handing them off without flourish, as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. The air itself felt thick with meaning. Moments between songs were like breaths between sentences, small but essential. They carried weight precisely because they were quiet. The guests seemed to understand this without needing to say it. Their laughter was lighter now, their words gentler. Even the house, which had swelled with music and motion, seemed to rest its bones, creaking softly in approval. Morty finally broke the silence between himself and Summer. "It's different now, like the whole party is." Slowing down, Summer nodded, her eyes far away. "Yeah, it's like everyone's remembering something, or waiting for something. But not in a bad way, more like they don't want it to end, so they're holding on to the moment." Her words landed deep in Morty's chest. He thought about endings, how they always came no matter how hard you tried to stretch the moments. He thought about school days fading into summers, about cartoons he'd outgrown, about friends who had drifted away. And now this party. He wanted to hold on to it too, even though he knew he couldn't. A guest approached them then, a being shaped like glass, glowing faintly from within. It didn't speak, but when it sat across from them, the soft hum of its body filled the silence with a music of its own. Summer smiled, and Morty found himself smiling too. They didn't need words. Sometimes presence was enough. The song shifted again, faint chords rising from the speakers but slower, gentler, almost hesitant. It wasn't the return of chaos, not yet. It was a continuation, like the party itself wanted to remind everyone that it still lived, even in its quiet. Rick emerged from the kitchen, eyes scanning the room. He noticed Morty and Summer sitting quietly, noticed the guests leaning close, noticed the hush that hung over everything. He smirked faintly but didn't interrupt. Instead, he sat on the edge of the couch, sipping from his flask, letting the silence soak in. For a man who lived in noise, the clatter of machines, the crack of portals opening, the sharp edge of his own voice, even Rick seemed to understand the beauty of the in-between. He muttered something to himself, so low no one caught it. A word, maybe two, swallowed by the house, but his eyes softened again, betraying him in a way his voice never would. The music shifted once more, louder now, but the echo of the pause lingered in the air. Morty carried it with him, tucked somewhere deep where the noise of the world couldn't touch it. He realized then that parties weren't just about noise and laughter and light. They were also about the spaces between, the moments where you looked someone in the eye and saw yourself reflected. Softer, clearer, truer. As the song swelled, Summer leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the kind of stuff I don't want to forget." Morty swallowed, his throat tight, and nodded. "Me too." The house hummed in agreement, its walls holding the memory gently. As though it understood, the music drifted into something brighter, a thread of melody that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Summer leaned against the wall, her shoulders relaxed yet her mind restless. She had laughed, she had danced, she had shined in the glow of strangers' eyes. And now, as the night softened into its deeper hours, she found herself pulled inward. It wasn't that she was unhappy, far from it. The party had lit something inside her, a spark of daring she rarely allowed herself to feel. But in the space between the songs, in the breaths between conversations, she began to notice another voice, quieter, softer, a reflection rising inside her like a tide she hadn't expected. She looked at Morty, who was speaking with a guest that appeared to be made of shifting petals, each movement sending gentle fragrance into the air. Morty's nervous energy had softened. He was still awkward, still uncertain, but there was a bravery there that she hadn't seen before, a kind of bending, as though he was learning how to move with the night rather than against it. She felt proud of him in a way that surprised her, as though the party wasn't only his challenge but hers too. She sipped her glowing drink and let her eyes wander. The guests seemed slower now, less hurried, more thoughtful. Even the stranger ones, the beings of vapor, the fragments of light, had found places to sit, to rest, to talk in hushed voices. The house no longer felt like it was bursting. Instead it breathed, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that matched her own. Summer had always carried a hunger she couldn't name. Sometimes it looked like wanting to be noticed, other times like wanting to disappear. She was still figuring out which parts of her were real and which parts were masks. And tonight, in the middle of this impossible gathering, she felt both seen and hidden at once. A tall guest approached her then, their form shifting between colors with each step. Their smile was kind, their eyes shimmering like a pond catching moonlight. They didn't speak immediately, and neither did she. Instead, they stood near her, leaning against the same wall as if to say, "I see you, even in your quiet." She smiled back just slightly, and it was enough. The music lifted, soft and steady, and someone laughed across the room. The sound was clear, pure, almost childlike. Summer closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her parents, about their absence tonight, about how the house felt lighter without their constant corrections, their quiet arguments. She loved them, but she also loved this freedom. And yet, she wondered if they would ever understand this version of her, the one who glowed under strings of impossible light, the one who didn't just survive but thrived. When she opened her eyes again, Morty was watching her. Not in a clingy way, but in a way that said he noticed. For once she didn't roll her eyes or push him away. She simply met his gaze, steady and warm, and he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a younger brother who annoyed her, but of someone who was quietly proud. Summer felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. The shifting color guest finally spoke, their voice low and melodic. "You shine, you know. Even if you don't always see it." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Shine? I'm just me. Half the time I don't even know who that is." The guest tilted their head. "That's the point. The ones who wonder who they are often shine the brightest. The wondering itself is light." Summer didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to compliments that weren't about her appearance, her style, her attitude. She was used to surface-level recognition, the kind that came and went like passing weather. But this felt different. It settled somewhere deep, somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted anyone else to reach. She nodded. Quiet. And the guest smiled again before slipping back into the crowd, leaving her with the echo of their words. The night carried on, but Summer stayed thoughtful. She thought about fleetingness, how quickly things began and ended, how easily moments slipped through fingers. The party felt endless, yet she knew it would not last. Nothing ever did. But maybe that was the point. Maybe beauty lived in the fleeting, in the fragile. Maybe it was enough to live fully in this night, knowing it would fade into memory by morning. Morty came to her side then, holding a half-empty cup, his cheeks still flushed from whatever strange conversation he had been lost in. "You okay?" he asked, not with worry but with genuine care. She smiled at him, small but real. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "About how fast everything goes. About how much I don't want to forget this." Morty nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." They stood together for a while, silent, listening to the hum of the house, the murmur of voices, the quiet pulse of music. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded filling. It was the kind that said, "I understand even without words." Summer felt herself soften in that silence. She thought about her younger self, the one who had hidden behind walls of sarcasm and bravado. She thought about the girl she might yet become, stronger, kinder, maybe wiser. And in that moment, she didn't feel the need to have all the answers. It was enough to feel alive here, in this fleeting dream of a night. The song shifted again, livelier this time, pulling some of the guests back into motion. Summer didn't move right away. She stayed in the corner, sipping her drink, letting the reflection linger a little longer. She knew the night would keep moving, keep carrying her forward. But for now she was content to pause, to notice, to breathe. She glanced at Morty once more. He was looking at her with something like admiration, and she found herself smiling without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, she felt not just like a teenager, but like a dreamer. The house seemed to hum in agreement, its walls glowing faintly with the memory of her realization. And then the music rose again, carrying everyone forward, but leaving her reflection gently imprinted in the night. The house swelled like a tide rolling toward its peak. What had begun as laughter and quiet conversations now stretched into something bigger, fuller, almost too much for its walls to hold. The air itself seemed to shimmer, heavy with warmth, music, and voices weaving together in a strange harmony. Guests kept arriving, not with doors knocking or portals blazing, but with the quiet inevitability of dreams spilling into each other. A flicker of light would pass through the corner of a room and suddenly become a being in conversation. A door half opened onto the hallway revealed not emptiness, but a group of travelers carrying instruments that hummed with their own inner glow. It was as though the house had become porous, leaking into other worlds and pulling them back in return. Morty stood in the center of it all, wide-eyed. The living room, once so familiar, had dissolved into something unrecognizable. The couches were covered in cloths that looked like spilled starlight. The ceiling seemed taller than it should have been, and the floor hummed with faint vibrations, as though the house itself were dancing. Summer thrived in this expansion. She moved easily through the swelling crowd, her laughter sparking bright, her voice carrying in the rising chorus. She was no longer simply part of the party. She seemed to be part of the current that kept it moving. When she leaned close to listen to a guest, or when she spun with glowing bracelets around her wrist, she pulled people deeper into the night's embrace. Morty watched her, and felt both admiration and distance, as though she belonged to the very glow that overwhelmed him. Rick sat back in a chair that hadn't been there before, sipping from a flask that seemed smaller with every drink. His eyes were sharp, following the surging tide of the night, yet there was something almost relaxed in his posture. He wasn't fighting it, wasn't controlling it. He was letting it happen, watching as the house carried itself beyond the reach of ordinary logic. The music pulsed louder, no longer background but heartbeat. It filled the walls, the floor, even the windows, that now reflected not just the inside of the house, but impossible skies beyond. Shapes swirled in those panes of glass, constellations bending, moons folding into each other, stars collapsing softly into blossoms of light. Morty pressed against the wall, his breath shallow. It was beautiful but overwhelming. The more guests poured in, the smaller he felt, as though he might dissolve into the current and be forgotten. He searched for an anchor, his sister, his grandfather, even the familiar texture of the couch, but everything had been absorbed into the tide. Yet in that dizziness, something stirred. A whisper not outside but inside, "This is too much. But you are still here." He held on to that whisper like a rope. He took a step forward, then another, moving through the crowd instead of away from it. His heart raced, but his feet carried him. He nodded at strangers who turned into friends with just a glance, exchanged words he couldn't remember seconds later, laughed at jokes he didn't fully understand. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he didn't retreat. Summer found him in the center of it all, cheeks flushed, hair sticking to his forehead. "Morty, you're actually talking to people," she shouted over the music, half teasing, half proud. Morty shrugged, embarrassed but smiling. "I guess, yeah. I guess I am." She grinned at him, and for once the grin wasn't older sibling condescension. It was acknowledgement, recognition of his courage, however small. The house creaked under the weight of its fullness. Tables bent with forgotten cups and half-eaten snacks. Walls swayed with the vibrations of too many feet, and the staircase groaned under clusters of guests who leaned together in whispered confidences. Yet the house didn't break. It stretched. It breathed. It held. Rick raised his flask and muttered into the hum, "Hold it together, old girl. Just a little longer." Whether he meant the house or himself, no one could tell. The energy surged higher. A group of guests lifted instruments that looked like liquid glass and began to play along with the music, their tones spilling into the air like water over stone. Voices rose with them, laughter cascading, footsteps stomping lightly in rhythm. The Smith home had become a universe unto itself, infinite within its walls. And yet, even in this overflowing, there were pockets of stillness. Morty noticed them in flashes. Two guests sitting silently on the staircase, their hands just barely touching. Summer leaning against the kitchen doorway, her smile small but real as she caught her breath. Rick pausing mid-sip, his gaze softening on something no one else could see. The abundance didn't erase the intimacy. Gad carried it, magnified it, held it like a jewel in water. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over him. He thought of his parents far away, thinking the house was empty and quiet. He thought of himself days ago, worried about homework, about fitting in, about the awkwardness of being small in a big world. And here he was, lost in a tide of beings from countless corners of reality, yet not drowning. Still here, still breathing, still growing. The house seemed to hum its approval, its beams trembling but unbroken. Summer returned to his side, her hair damp with sweat, her cheeks radiant with glow. She leaned in, her voice almost lost in the music. "That feels like it'll never end." Morty swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah, but it will." She looked at him, surprised by his certainty, then nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I don't want to miss any of it." And with that, she disappeared back into the current, luminous and bold. Morty stayed where he was, not chasing her, not hiding either. Just standing, letting the house overflow around him, learning how to stand steady in the flood. Rick leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. His smirk was faint, his breath deep. For all the madness he had seen, all the chaos he had built, this, his family, their house, their strange glowing night, was a kind of abundance he rarely allowed himself to notice. The house overflowed, but it did not collapse. Not yet. Instead, it stretched into something larger than itself, holding everyone, holding everything, in a fragile, luminous embrace, and the night carried on. The party swelled like a tide at its highest point, the walls of the Smith home shimmering, as though they could no longer contain the abundance within. Morty felt himself caught between awe and overwhelm, his chest tight, his thoughts racing in circles. And yet in that very dizziness, something shifted. He realized he could not control the tide. He could not stop guests from appearing, from multiplying, from spilling laughter into every corner of the house. He could not demand silence when the music was pounding, nor ask the universe to slow down when it was spinning faster than he could follow. But he could change himself. He could bend. At first the bending was small. A stranger brushed against him with a body that flickered like a candle flame, and instead of recoiling, Morty laughed awkwardly and said, "A nice, shimmer thing you got going on." The being pulsed faintly in response, a sign of approval. Morty smiled despite himself. Later he found himself in a circle of guests playing a strange game that seemed to involve stacking invisible shapes in the air. He didn't understand the rules, but instead of backing away, he mimicked their movements, fumbling at first, then finding a rhythm. When his imaginary tower collapsed, they all laughed together, not at him, but with him. His face burned red, but it was the good kind of warmth, the kind that meant he belonged. He bent again when a guest with 1,000 tiny eyes leaned close, asking him a question in a language of chimes. Morty didn't know the words, but he nodded and answered softly, "Yeah. Can I get you?" To his surprise, the being seemed satisfied, its many eyes blinking in unison like stars. Morty exhaled. Maybe understanding wasn't always about words. Maybe it was about openness, about allowing meaning to pass through you like light through glass. The more he bent, the lighter he felt. Summer noticed it too. She watched him from across the room, her expression softening. Her brother, usually stiff and timid, was moving with the flow of the night. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but willingly. He was adapting, not resisting. She thought of him as a sapling in the wind, bending so he would not break. Rick, on the other hand, leaned in the kitchen doorway, his flask in hand, his gaze sharp but distant. He saw Morty bending, stretching, reshaping himself in small ways. Rick's lips twitched in something like pride, though he would never name it aloud. To him, Morty's willingness to bend meant survival. To Morty himself, it meant something gentler, growth. As the night deepened, Morty found himself dancing, not well, not gracefully, but moving all the same. A guest with feathered arms twirled beside him, guiding his steps. Morty laughed at his own clumsiness, but he didn't stop. For once, embarrassment didn't freeze him. It melted into joy, into a strange freedom he hadn't expected. He thought about his days at school, about how often he had felt trapped in the rigid lines of who he was supposed to be. He thought about the pressure to speak when he didn't know what to say, the awkward silences, the jokes that landed wrong. Here in this overflowing house, none of that seemed to matter. Here he could stumble, bend, laugh, and still be part of it all. At one point he slipped into the hallway to catch his breath. The crowd pressed at his back, but the hallway was quieter, its light softer. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. His heart was still racing, but not from fear. From something gentler, something like possibility. Summer found him there, her glow still bright, her hair damp with sweat from dancing. She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "You okay?" Morty opened his eyes and nodded. "Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm not fighting it anymore. Like I'm learning how to go with it." Summer smiled, not teasing this time. "So that's called bending, Morty. That's how you keep from snapping." He blinked at her. "Bending?" "Yeah." She leaned beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You know, life's not always about holding your ground. Sometimes it's about letting the wind push you, just enough so you don't break." Morty thought about that, his chest swelling with something he couldn't name. He looked back toward the living room, where the lights pulsed and the laughter rolled. For the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own home. He felt like part of it, like the bending had woven him into the fabric of the night. When they returned to the party, the music shifted again, softer this time, almost like a lullaby hidden under the beats. Morty let it carry him, swaying with the crowd, his awkwardness dissolving into motion. Each step, each glance, each laugh was a small surrender, not a loss, but a gift. Rick, watching from his corner, muttered under his breath, "Kid's finally learning." His voice was rough, but his eyes softened just for a moment, reflecting the same light that filled the house. The Smith home creaked again, its walls straining but not breaking. It seemed to understand what Morty had discovered. that bending was not weakness but resilience. The house bent too, stretching itself to hold the impossible, to keep the night alive just a little longer. Morty smiled, his body loose, his heart light. For once he didn't worry about what came next. He bent, and the night bent with him. The party pressed on, swelling and folding like a dream that refused to end, but Rick sat apart from it, half-shadowed in the kitchen doorway. His flask was nearly empty, yet he tipped it again, as if hoping the echo at the bottom would fill him more than the liquid ever could. The glow of the house touched his shoulders. The hum of laughter carried through his bones. But inside him, a quieter tide rose, one he did not share with anyone. For all his brilliance, for all the chaos he could conjure with a flick of invention, Rick carried with him a hollowness. It slipped out in pauses, in the lines beneath his eyes, in the sighs he didn't mean to let slip between his teeth. He was surrounded tonight by beings from impossible corners of the cosmos, by family who had learned to move with his madness, by music that shook the walls themselves. And yet, a part of him still sat alone. He lifted his eyes and saw Morty swaying awkwardly with a group of guests, his body loose, his smile unforced. He saw Summer leaning against the wall, glowing with a strange, quiet confidence. He even thought fleetingly of Beth and Jerry, absent in their weekend away, believing their home sat empty and still. A smirk tugged at Rick's lips, bitter and fond all at once. They don't know what's happening here, he thought, and maybe that's good. Maybe some things don't need to be known to be real. But beneath the smirk, beneath the flicker of pride at Morty's small courage and Summer's growing reflection, something else stirred. A loneliness old and worn, one he rarely named. He had built universes, toppled regimes, escaped prisons of every kind, and yet he had never escaped himself. The party reflected that ache back at him. Every laugh he heard carried the ghost of one he had lost. Every stranger's face shimmered with reminders of those who had walked beside him once, only to vanish into memory. He thought of old friends long gone, of adventures that had burned bright and then flickered out. He thought of family fractured in ways no gathering could mend. And he thought of the one constant, the flask in his hand, the sharpness on his tongue, the way he buried longing beneath 1,000 distractions. He muttered into the noise, though no one heard. It's all temporary. That's the thing. Doesn't matter how wild you make it, it ends. It always ends. The words sank into the hum of the house, carried away by the vibration of footsteps and clinking glasses. He wasn't asking for anyone to listen. It was enough to let them out, to give his longing shape, however brief. A guest approached him then, a tall figure with skin like dark glass and eyes that glowed faintly blue. They held no drink, spoke no greeting, simply stood beside him as though sensing the ache he carried. Rick didn't look at them directly, but he didn't send them away either. Sometimes silence was the closest thing to understanding. The music shifted again, brighter, pulling laughter from the living room. Rick glanced over and caught Morty's face, flushed and happy, his awkwardness forgotten for the moment. The sight struck Rick harder than he expected. Morty, bending and softening, learning to carry himself in a way Rick himself had never learned. That stirred something like pride, but also something like regret. He whispered into his flask, almost bitter, "Kid's better at this than I ever was." And wasn't that the truth? For all his genius, Rick had never been good at bending, at softening, at letting the tide carry him without fighting. He had built and destroyed, run and hidden, but he had never learned the simple courage Morty was finding tonight. That courage came not from brilliance, not from defiance, but from presence. Rick swallowed hard, the flask burning his throat. For a moment, the party blurred. He saw not the crowd before him, but echoes, faces that were no longer here, moments that had slipped away. The laugh of a friend he would never hear again. The warmth of family fractured beyond repair. The ache of all the nights he had tried to drown out with noise, invention, distraction. He leaned against the doorway heavy, and the guest beside him finally spoke in a voice like glass, breaking gently. Even in abundance, the emptiness lingers. Doesn't it? Rick's smirk faltered. He didn't answer at first. Then he muttered, "Yeah, but you get used to it. Or you pretend you do." The guest said nothing more, only bowed their heads slightly, as though acknowledging a truth too heavy to lift. Then they slipped back into the crowd, leaving Rick alone with the echo of his own words. For a long moment he stayed there, letting the noise of the party wash over him. He could have joined in, Could have danced, could have laughed, could have let himself dissolve into the tide. But that wasn't who he was. His place, it seemed, was always at the edge, always holding the flask, always carrying the absence even when surrounded by life, and yet, when he looked again at Morty and Summer, he felt something loosen inside him. Maybe it was enough for now to watch them bend, to watch them grow, to watch them claim moments he himself had lost long ago. Maybe his longing didn't have to vanish. Maybe it could simply sit beside their joy, shadow to their light. The music rose again, brighter than before, pulling the guests into fresh motion. Rick tipped his flask one last time, smirked faintly at the empty air and whispered, "Yeah, enjoy it while it lasts." His voice was soft, almost tender. Not quite hope, not quite despair, something in between. And the night carried it gently, folding his absent longing into its overflowing song. The air inside the house had grown thick with warmth, the kind of warmth that comes not just from bodies pressed together, but from the pulse of laughter, from music moving through floorboards, from glasses raised and voices overlapping. And yet, beyond the walls, the night stretched wide and calm, like a velvet curtain holding the world in its quiet hands. Morty slipped out first. The noise behind him softened as the door clicked shut, replaced by the hum of crickets and the distant hush of a late summer breeze. He drew in a deep breath, his lungs grateful for air that carried no smoke, no heat, only the scent of grass and the faint sweetness of blossoms half asleep in the garden. For a long moment, he just stood there staring at the dark sky above, the stars flickering in their endless patience. Summer joined him not long after. She nudged the door open with her hip, a faint grin still lighting her face from whatever conversation she had left inside. "Needed some air?" she asked, though the question was soft, almost rhetorical. Morty nodded. "Yeah, it's a lot in there." His voice carried the hush of someone who didn't want to break the night. Summer leaned against the porch railing, her eyes lifting skyward. The glow from the house fell over her shoulders, but her face turned toward the starlight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was full, like the pause between breaths. The stars above seemed impossibly still, yet alive, glittering with a rhythm older than any of them. Morty felt himself pulled into that vastness, his small worries stretching thin, dissolving into something bigger. He glanced at Summer, saw the same faraway reflection in her eyes. It comforted him knowing she was looking too. "You ever think about how many people are out there?" Morty asked suddenly. "Like, not just aliens, but whole lives. People laughing, fighting, dreaming. And we're just here?" Summer smiled faintly, the corner of her lips tugging upward. "All the time. But you know what? Right now I'm glad I'm just here, with you." Morty blinked, surprised, and then his shoulders softened. Her words landed gently, not dramatic, not forced, just true. He didn't always understand Summer, but he understood her heart in that moment. The music inside the house shifted, slow and lilting, spilling faintly through the open windows. The notes floated into the night like drifting fireflies. Summer extended her hand without hesitation, playful yet steady. "Dance with me," she said. Morty hesitated, his cheeks warming. "Out here?" "There's no one—" "Exactly," she interrupted softly. "There's no one. Just us, the stars. The night." He swallowed, then placed his hand in hers. Her grip was sure, grounding. Together they stepped onto the grass, the blades cool beneath their shoes, the air wrapping them in quiet embrace. The song from inside barely reached them, but it was enough, a faint rhythm, a thread to guide their steps. They moved awkwardly at first. Morty stumbled, muttered an apology, his movements stiff with self-consciousness. But Summer only laughed, light and unbothered, and pulled him gently closer. "Stop thinking," she whispered. "Just be here," Morty tried. He let the night carry him, let the stars watch without judgment, let his body sway in time with hers. Slowly his shoulders loosened, his steps steadied. His smile grew, hesitant but real. Above them the constellations stretched in quiet patterns, ancient and enduring. To Morty they felt closer tonight, as though the universe had bent its ear to listen. Each flicker of light felt like an audience, but not the kind that mocked. It was the kind that bore witness, that honored their smallness by holding it gently. Summer tilted her head back, laughing softly into the sky. "This feels like something people write about," she said, "like a moment you don't forget, even when everything else fades." Morty didn't know what to say. His chest swelled with something he couldn't name, a mix of awe, of belonging, of fragile joy. Instead, he just nodded, his eyes fixed on hers, then on the stars again. For a while they moved like that, two siblings dancing beneath a universe too vast to hold, yet close enough to feel. The grass bent beneath their weight, the breeze traced their skin, and the faint hum of music tied them to the house they had briefly escaped. When the song inside ended, the silence outside felt deeper, as though the night itself had hushed to honor what had passed. Neither of them moved away. Their hands remained linked, their bodies still swaying gently, even without sound. Morty spoke finally, his voice soft. I think I'm starting to get it. How things don't last. But maybe that's what makes them, I don't know, precious. Summer's eyes glistened faintly, reflecting the stars. She gave his hand a squeeze. Yeah, that's exactly it. From the doorway, unseen by them, Rick watched for a brief moment. His silhouette was swallowed in shadow, but his eyes caught the starlight. He didn't intrude, didn't mutter a joke or spill a warning. He only watched, the flask heavy in his hand, before retreating back into the noise of the party. For all his longing, he knew better than to touch moments that weren't his. Out in the yard, Summer and Morty kept swaying, their steps quiet, their breaths steady. Above them the stars remained, patient, eternal, yet somehow close enough to touch. And for that brief, fragile span of time, the universe felt not endless, but intimate. The party ebbed and flowed like the tide, swelling into waves of laughter, before sinking into quieter pools of conversation. As the night stretched on, it became less about noise and more about presence, a room full of beings, some human, some not, all sharing the same fragile span of hours. Morty drifted among them, the glow of his dance beneath the stars still softening his steps. He no longer felt quite as lost in the current. Instead, he let it carry him, nudging him toward faces that turned to meet his with faint smiles, with curious eyes, with the openness that only comes when everyone knows the night is temporary. At the kitchen table, a being with translucent skin tapped rhythms against a glass. Morty sat beside them, unsure of what to say, but the guest only looked at him and said, "Every beat is a memory waiting to fade. Still we tap." Morty nodded, the words settling inside him like a pebble in water. They didn't need to speak more. Just sitting there, listening to the soft tapping, was enough. Across the room, Summer was leaning against the couch, her arms folded, listening to two strangers tell a story that made no linear sense. They spoke of planets that bloomed like flowers, of rivers that sang instead of flowing, of lovers who met in dreams and never again in waking life. Summer laughed at the strangeness, but also felt the edges of her heart soften. She realized in that moment that stories didn't have to make sense to matter. They only had to be shared. Rick moved between the rooms, silent more often than not. He caught fragments of conversation, snatches of song, glimpses of beings who belong nowhere else but here tonight. And for a moment, even he could not deny the pull of connection. Still, he kept his distance, his absent longing stitched into every smirk and mutter. The house itself seemed to pulse with these bonds. The walls held laughter, the floors cradled footsteps, the very air hummed with the weight of so many lives intersecting for one night only. It was a fragile gathering, one spark away from collapse, yet glowing all the brighter for its fragility. Morty found himself sitting with a girl his age, or close enough, though her eyes shimmered like pools of mercury. She asked him about Earth, about school, about what it felt like to be small in a world so wide. Morty stumbled over his words, but she didn't mind. She only smiled a little sadly and said, "I'll probably never see you again, but I'll remember this, even if it's just a flicker." Her honesty struck him more than any compliment could. He felt the truth of it, the way people brushed against each other's lives, sometimes leaving only a faint trace, yet altering the shape of memory forever. When she stood and drifted back into the crowd, Morty stayed still, holding her words in his chest. Summer, too, felt those echoes. She found herself talking with a pair of guests who looked like siblings, their features nearly mirrored, except for the colors of their skin. One a pale lavender, the other a deep blue. They bickered gently, teased each other, then fell into laughter that rang like bells. Summer smiled, watching them, and felt a tug of recognition. In their bond, she saw herself and Morty, the way they sparred, the way they grew in each other's presence, the way, despite everything, They would always return to the same center. The night pressed on. Some guests slipped quietly away, vanishing without goodbyes, their absence noticed only by the soft emptiness they left behind. Others grew quieter, their conversations turning to whispers, as if the night itself demanded reverence. The party was not collapsing yet, but its edges had begun to fray, the abundance gently loosening. Rick stood at the window, staring out at the yard where Morty and Summer had danced. He felt the echoes too, though he would never admit it aloud. Each fleeting bond, each fragile connection, they reminded him of everything he had lost and everything he still, in some buried part of himself, longed for. He raised his flask again, muttering under his breath. The words dissolved before anyone could catch them. But the ache remained. Back in the living room, Morty joined a small circle of guests who had started humming together, their voices blending into a low, soothing drone. No words, no language, and just sound, soft and steady. Morty closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He felt both alone and together, held and released, small and infinite. The hum carried him somewhere quiet inside himself, a place where fear loosened its grip and wonder settled in. When the humming faded, the circle broke apart. Morty opened his eyes to find himself smiling. A tear caught on his cheek, though he hadn't realized it was there. He wiped it away quickly, embarrassed, but no one laughed. No one even asked. They simply moved on, leaving the echo of the sound behind. Summer returned to him, sliding down onto the floor beside where he sat. She didn't say anything, just nudged her shoulder against his. He nudged back. That was enough. Words weren't always needed. The bonds formed that night were fragile, everyone knew it. Guests would leave, memories would blur, connections would fade into the mist of time. But the fragility was not weakness. It was beauty. It was what made every laugh, every glance, every hum resonate all the deeper. And so the party continued, not with the loudness of chaos, but with the quiet awe of impermanence. Every moment carried its own echo, soft and fleeting, like footsteps in snow. In the heart of the Smith house, surrounded by faces they might never see again, Morty and Summer found themselves changed. Rick too, though he would never say so, felt the tug of something human in the bonds that flickered around him. And the house itself, breathing with their presence, held those echoes in its walls, if only for tonight. The night had grown heavy with its own fullness. The house, once merely a vessel for family life, now sagged with the weight of everything it had held, voices, footsteps, songs, fleeting connections. It was not breaking, not shattering, but beginning to exhale, like a chest finally loosening after too long a breath. The party had swelled to its brightest point, and now it bent toward its quiet unraveling. It began not with noise, but with silence. Conversations that had been lively only an hour ago drifted into pauses. Guests looked around as though suddenly aware of the lateness, of the way dawn was hiding somewhere just beyond the horizon. A few slipped toward the door without farewells, vanishing as quietly as they had come. Empty spaces grew in their wake, and the air shifted to fill them. Morty noticed it first in the music. Earlier the rhythm had been bold, carrying everyone along. Now the notes stumbled softer, as if even the instruments had grown tired. He stood in the corner of the living room, watching people he had never known, people he might never see again, moving with slower steps. The energy was still there, but it trembled now, stretched thin. Summer leaned against the wall, her head tilted back. Her glow had not vanished, but it flickered differently now, not bold confidence, but the quiet knowledge of endings. She caught Morty's eyes and gave him a small smile. Neither of them spoke, but the smile carried the message clearly. It's almost over, isn't it? In the kitchen, Rick slumped into a chair, his flask resting loosely in his hand. He didn't push the party forward anymore. He just let it fall, watching the unraveling with a strange tenderness. He had seen this arc before. Beginnings bright and wild, middles abundant, endings that sighed instead of screamed. Every world, every invention, every memory seemed to bend toward collapse. But tonight the collapse was gentle. He almost admired it. The house itself seemed to groan softly, the floorboards creaking as if shifting beneath the strain of too many footsteps, too many echoes. Cups clinked faintly, forgotten on tables. Coats lay draped over chairs, their owners long gone. The once surreal abundance of the gathering had begun to fade, leaving behind remnants instead of presence. Morty wandered through the rooms, sensing the change in his chest. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief, because the noise had grown so heavy it was almost suffocating. Sadness, because endings always carried a sting, even when they came softly. He passed by a guest curled on the couch, eyes closed, their form shimmering faintly, as though they might dissolve back into whatever world had sent them here. Another guest stood at the window, staring at the stars with a wistful expression, before fading like smoke. Morty paused, watching, realizing he was witnessing the natural rhythm of things. Arrivals, presences, departures. No one forced it. It simply happened. Summer joined him at the threshold of the living room. She crossed her arms, leaning lightly against him. "Feels weird," she whispered. Morty nodded. "Yeah, like the end of a dream." Her eyes softened. Maybe that's what it was. Inside the hum of the house, small conversations still sparked here and there, but they were dim embers compared to the flames of earlier. Guests no longer shouted over music. They spoke in murmurs, exchanged glances that said more than words. Even laughter, still present, carried an edge of tiredness, as though it knew it would fade soon. Rick rose from his chair at last, stretching his stiff shoulders. He looked around at the mess, at the fading crowd, and muttered, "Well, guess that's it. Everything burns bright, then fizzles. Story of existence." His tone was flat, but the faintest curl of fondness tugged at his mouth. He stepped outside for a breath of night air. The stars were still there, watching, indifferent yet eternal. Rick tilted his head back, the cool air brushing his face, and let the silence settle around him. Behind him the house sighed again, its energy dimming. He thought of Morty and Summer inside, watching the collapse with young eyes. He thought of himself, watching with old ones. He wondered briefly which was harder. Back indoors, Morty picked up a cup left on the floor and set it on the table. It wasn't his mess to fix, but the gesture felt right. Summer began gathering coats, folding them gently, even though their owners were gone. Neither of them spoke much. Their movements were small, deliberate, almost reverent. The guests that remained began to say soft goodbyes. Some bowed, some waved, some simply dissolved. A few touched Morty's shoulder or offered Summer a smile before vanishing. Each farewell felt less like an ending and more like a whisper of gratitude. Slowly the rooms emptied. The abundance that had once overflowed now thinned into space again. The walls, though still humming faintly, seemed to relax, their pulse slowing. The house had carried the night's weight, and now it was laying it down. Morty sank into the couch at last, his body tired but his mind awake. He thought of the guests he'd met, of the girl with mercury eyes, of the humming circle, of the small courage he had found. He felt sadness that it was over, but also a deep peace. It didn't have to last forever to mean something. Summer sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "It's like sand slipping through your hands," she said softly. "You can't keep it. You just feel it while it's there." Morty nodded. "Yes, and maybe that's enough." Rick came back inside, his flask swinging lightly at his side. He looked at them on the couch, their faces calm, their eyes tired but clear. For a moment he wanted to say something, a joke, a warning, a piece of advice, but instead he just sat down across from them and let the silence hold. The collapse of the party wasn't violent. It wasn't messy. It was simply natural. A tide receding, a candle guttering, a breath releasing, gentle, unavoidable, whole. And in that collapse, each of them, Rick, Morty, Summer, the house itself, found a strange kind of rest. When the last of the guests slipped away, the Smith house exhaled. The walls, once trembling with laughter and music, now seemed to sag into their quiet bones. What remained was not silence exactly, but a softer hum, the aftersound of what had been. It was as though the night itself lingered, unwilling to leave entirely. Empty cups dotted the tables like tiny monuments, each one holding the ghost of a conversation. Some were smeared with lipstick, others half full with forgotten drinks, their surfaces catching the dim light. Morty touched one gently, as if it might still be warm from the hand that left it. It wasn't, but it carried weight nonetheless, proof that someone had been there, if only for a while. Coats still lay over chairs, their shapes slumped as though the guests might return at any moment to collect them. A scarf draped across the stair rail fluttered faintly when the air moved, as though sighing. On the kitchen counter, crumbs and spilled drops of liquid formed patterns that looked almost intentional, like the markings of a night too alive to be tidy. Summer walked slowly through the rooms, her bare feet brushing the floor. She gathered cups into her arms, not rushing, not complaining. Each one felt like a fragment of memory she didn't want to lose. She found herself pausing at certain spots. The corner where she had laughed too loudly with a stranger, the space near the stereo where she had caught Morty watching her glow, the patch of grass outside still pressed flat from their dance. She held these moments like fragile glass, knowing they could never be remade. Morty followed behind her, quieter, more inward. He saw not just objects but echoes, the way the couch still held the indentation of someone curled there, the faint circle on the table where a sweating glass had sat, the echo of humming that still seemed to vibrate in the walls. He imagined voices in the stillness, laughter replaying itself in loops only he could hear. Rick wandered through last of all, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his eyes scanning everything with a kind of detached fondness. He wasn't sentimental, not outwardly, but even he could not ignore the peculiar ache of emptiness after abundance. He tapped a cup with his finger, lifted it, sniffed, and muttered, "Yeah, figures," before setting it back down. But his pause lasted longer than it needed to. The memories weren't loud. They didn't shout or demand. They rested quietly on tables in corners, in the air itself like dust illuminated in sunlight, small remnants, stubborn in their refusal to vanish. Summer set the cups down in the kitchen sink, the sound of glass clinking together echoing faintly. She leaned against the counter, her eyes distant. "It already feels unreal," she whispered. Morty joined her, nodding. "Yeah, like, did that really happen? Or was it just a dream we had together?" Rick smirked faintly, pulling a chair out and dropping into it. "Dream, reality, same thing. You remember it, so it happened. It doesn't matter if it lasts." His words were sharp, but the softness in his voice dulled the edge. The three of them sat in the half-lit kitchen, surrounded by the aftermath. For once no one felt the need to fill the space with words. The silence itself was memory, holding them in its arms. Eventually Morty stood and wandered back into the living room. He picked up a forgotten notebook, left by some guest whose name he didn't know. Flipping through it, he found scribbles of languages he couldn't read, sketches of faces that were half human, half not. He closed it gently and placed it back on the table, as though returning it to its rightful place, even though its owner was gone. Summer found a hairpin on the floor, delicate and shining. She twirled it between her fingers, imagining who it might have belonged to, what story it carried. For a moment she thought of keeping it, but instead she laid it on the table, letting it rest as a quiet keepsake of the night. Rick, meanwhile, noticed a bottle tipped over on its side, liquid dripping slowly onto the floor. He crouched, cleaned it up with a rag and muttered, "Even messes are memories." He tossed the rag into the sink, but his eyes lingered on the wet spot long after it had faded. The night was no longer alive with sound, but it lived in these remnants. Every cup, every scarf, every notebook and hairpin was a trace of connection. Fleeting, yes, but real. Outside, the stars still shone, patient as ever. Their light filtered faintly through the windows, falling across the tables where these remnants waited. Morty sat down on the couch, staring at the starlight touching the abandoned objects. He whispered, "It feels like they're still here, just quieter." Summer sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "They are, in some way." Rick didn't argue. He only leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. The faintest hum escaping his throat. A lullaby with no words. Just sound. And so the Smith house held its memories. Not in grand gestures, but in simple traces. Laughter still vibrating faintly in the walls. Coats draped carelessly like sleeping figures. Cups standing like monuments to moments that would never return. The party had ended. But what it left behind was its own kind of presence. Not noise, not chaos. Only quiet echoes, resting gently on tables, waiting to fade but not yet gone. The dawn arrived with no fanfare. Light crept softly into the Smith home, sliding through curtains left half-drawn, painting pale streaks across walls that still seemed to breathe faintly from the night before. The house carried the scent of spilled drinks and faint perfume, the kind that lingers even after windows are opened. It was a house that had lived, and now it waited for silence to return. Beth's car pulled into the driveway first, the sound of tires on gravel breaking the fragile quiet. Jerry's voice carried faintly as they stepped out, laughing at some private joke, their bags swinging casually in their hands. They had been gone long enough for the house to transform, and then settle again, and they returned unaware, stepping into a world layered with secrets they would never know. The front door creaked open. Beth entered first, pausing only to set her keys in the familiar bowl by the entrance. The air felt different, not immediately alarming, just faintly off, like stepping into a dream you've half forgotten. She frowned for a moment, then shook it off, convincing herself it was nothing more than the stillness of home after travel. Jerry, cheerful and oblivious, stretched his arms wide and sighed. "Ah, home sweet home. Smells the same, looks the same." His words rang loudly in the quiet, as though the house itself flinched at the lack of awareness. The house did not, in truth, look quite the same. To the eye it was ordinary enough, the furniture in place, no great mess in sight. But if one looked closer, the traces were there. A glass on the counter not put away, a cushion on the couch shifted just slightly, a faint smudge on the hardwood where laughter had once spilled over. The memory still clung, subtle but stubborn. Upstairs, Morty stirred in his bed. His dreams had been restless, filled with voices and faces dissolving like mist. When he heard the door open downstairs, his heart gave a small leap. The return of Beth and Jerry was both grounding and strange, like the return of order after a night that had broken every rule. He lay still for a moment, listening to their voices filter through the house, and he wondered if they would ever guess. Summer, awake already, sat by her window, watching them unload the car. She felt both comforted and disappointed. Their return marked the end, a closing of the chapter, the sealing of the night into memory. She touched the windowsill, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and whispered to herself, "They'll never know." Rick, of course, had no such sentiment. He lounged at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, as though he had been there all night. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp but tired. When Beth walked in and saw him, she smiled faintly. "Dad, you're up early." Rick shrugged, sipping his drink. "Didn't sleep much." "House gets lively sometimes." The corner of his mouth twitched in a half-smile, half-grimace. Beth glanced around the room but saw nothing out of place. Jerry hummed as he carried bags upstairs, too busy thinking about unpacking to notice anything odd. There was a strange grace in it, how the evidence of the night folded itself away, how the remnants chose silence over exposure. The coats had been collected, the cups cleared, the music stilled. What remained was only memory, and memory did not shout unless invited. Morty came down the stairs slowly, rubbing his eyes as though waking from a long, ordinary sleep. Summer followed a moment later, calm but inwardly alert. They both knew the truth, that their parents would never suspect, that this night would belong to them and Rick alone. Beth smiled at them, her tone warm. "Morning, kids. Everything okay while we were gone?" Summer nodded too quickly. Morty hesitated, then said softly, "Yeah, everything was fine." His words tasted like half-truths, but no one pressed further. Jerry reappeared, chuckling to himself. "See? House didn't fall apart without us. Not that I doubted it." Rick smirked at that, muttering something under his breath that sounded like, "Yeah, not even close," though he knew none of them would catch it. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with something like satisfaction. The party had ended, but its echo remained, tucked into the walls, hidden behind their return. For Morty, the moment felt almost surreal. He wanted to tell them about the guests, the music, the way the house had breathed alive for a single night. But he knew the telling would ruin it. Some things weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be carried quietly, like a secret stitched into the fabric of the heart. Summer felt the same. As her parents moved through the house, reclaiming it with their voices and their presence, she realized the party was now a story that belonged only to her, to Morty and to Rick. It would live in them differently, shaping them in ways her parents could not touch. The Smith home exhaled again, this time deeper, as though surrendering to the return of ordinary life. The wild dream had passed, folded into memory. Now it was just a house once more, walls, windows, rooms filled with the rhythm of routine. But in the quiet corners, if one looked closely, the remnants still shimmered faintly. A faint ring on the table where a glass had rested, a subtle dent in the couch, a hairpin forgotten and tucked away. Small things but real, proof that life had stretched itself wide, then settled again. Rick finished his coffee and set the mug down with a quiet clink. He didn't look at Beth or Jerry. Instead, he glanced at Morty and Summer, a knowing look passing silently between them. They held his gaze for a breath, and in that moment they all understood. What had happened would not be spoken of, but it would never be forgotten. Beth began unpacking the groceries, humming softly. Jerry busied himself with the mail. The world slipped back into its familiar rhythm, as though nothing had happened. But the children knew better. And Rick knew best of all. The house had been a universe for a single night. Now it was just a home again, but in the quiet of their hearts the party still lingered, not in noise, not in chaos, but in memory. The Smith home seemed to sigh once more, as though relieved to return to its steady rhythm. Morning light stretched across the living room, soft and forgiving, as if it wished to cover over the traces of what had come before. The party had ended hours ago, and now silence was the only guest that lingered. The air felt cleansed, though not entirely empty. If one listened carefully, there was still a subtle vibration, a ghost of laughter echoing faintly in the walls. But the house itself had settled back into its role. Not a stage, not a portal, not a gathering place of strange colors and stranger beings, but simply a home. Morty sat quietly at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal before him, though he barely touched it. His mind wandered back to the hours when the house had pulsed with music, when faces from other worlds had drifted past him like living dreams. He wondered how something so large, so surreal, could fold itself neatly into memory overnight. He stirred his spoon slowly, watching the ripples in the milk fade. Summer joined him, her hair still tousled from sleep. She didn't speak at first. She simply sat across from him, resting her chin in her hand. For a moment, the silence between them was heavier than words, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of shared experience, of knowing without needing to explain. Finally she whispered, "Feels weird, doesn't it?" "Like none of it happened," Morty nodded. "Yeah, but it did. I can still, feel it. Like the house remembers, too." His voice was soft, almost reverent. Rick shuffled into the room, carrying a half-empty flask instead of a coffee mug this time. His eyes were shadowed, but he wore the same expression he always did, a mix of sharp awareness and casual dismissal. He dropped into a chair, the flask clinking gently against the table. "The house doesn't remember anything," he muttered, though there was no bite in his tone. "Houses don't remember, people do. And then even people forget sooner or later." Summer frowned. "I don't think I'll forget." Rick raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He simply leaned back, staring at the ceiling as though it held secrets only he could see. Perhaps in his own way, he was grateful for their insistence on remembering. Perhaps he knew the night had marked them in ways too subtle to vanish. Upstairs, Beth unpacked clothes from her trip, humming softly to herself. Jerry organized the pile of mail with more focus than necessary, pleased by the return of normalcy. Neither of them suspected that while they had been gone, the house had opened itself to something extraordinary. And neither of them would ever know. The rhythm of life resumed its steady beat. The television flickered on with morning shows, the dishwasher hummed, footsteps padded across the hallway. The house accepted these sounds, enfolding them as if nothing had ever interrupted them. It rested, not in slumber but in a kind of quiet gratitude. Morty wandered into the living room and sank onto the couch. He ran his fingers over the fabric, noticing the small indent where someone had once sat, someone whose name he couldn't even remember. He smiled faintly, a private smile. It's like the house kept a little piece of it, he thought. Even if no one else noticed, he could feel it. Summer sat beside him, pulling a blanket across her lap. She sighed, leaning against the back of the couch. "I kind of liked it. All the people, the noise, the colors. It made me feel different." "Yeah," Morty said, his voice thoughtful. Like we were part of something bigger for a while." He hesitated, then added, "And then it was over." Rick appeared in the doorway, listening without comment. His eyes softened for the briefest of moments before he spoke. "That's how it goes, kids. Everything ends. Doesn't mean it didn't matter." His words hung in the air, more tender than he intended. The afternoon stretched on quietly. The Smith home no longer throbbed with energy. Instead, it absorbed the stillness, letting its walls cool, letting its floors rest. Even the air felt slower, as though inhaling deeply after too much excitement. In the backyard, the grass glistened with dew that had survived the sun's first climb. Morty and Summer stepped outside, breathing in the freshness. They looked up at the sky, pale blue and endless, and felt the strange weight of normal life settling back around them. The party seemed distant already, like a dream you strain to recall after waking. Yet the lessons lingered. Morty felt taller somehow, braver in small ways. Summer felt more aware of herself, as though a mirror had been held up to her heart. They didn't talk much about it, but they both knew. The night had given them something to carry forward. Rick remained inside, pouring himself another drink. He stared at the kitchen counter, tapping his fingers softly. His mind drifted to old nights, old parties, old universes that had come and gone. He was too old to be surprised by endings, but not so hardened that he didn't feel them. He glanced toward the window, where Morty and Summer sat in the grass, and something inside him softened again. By evening, the house had fully reclaimed its silence. Dinner was ordinary, Beth asking about school, Jerry retelling a story from their trip, the clink of silverware against plates. Morty and Summer answered politely, though their minds were elsewhere, still in the glow of memory. Rick barely spoke at all, sipping quietly, a faint smirk playing at his lips, as though he carried a secret no one else could read. When night fell, the Smith home finally seemed to exhale completely. The stars stretched wide above it, calm and unblinking. The house lay still, its walls no longer buzzing, its rooms once more just rooms. It rested not because it was tired, but because it had lived something rare, and now it needed quiet to hold it. Morty drifted to sleep with images of swirling colors and laughter in his mind. Summer dreamed of faces she might never see again, and of herself shining a little brighter among them. Rick stayed awake the longest, gazing out at the night, sipping from his flask in silence. He did not try to hold on to the night, for he knew he couldn't. He only let it linger, a gentle ember in the vastness of his mind. The Smith home rested. And in its rest, it carried memory the way walls sometimes do, not loudly, not visibly, but like a whisper too soft for words. The night returned gently, folding itself around the Smith home like a familiar blanket. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, the air outside cool and calm. Inside, Morty lay awake in his bed, his eyes tracing the shadows on the ceiling. Sleep tugged at him, but something in his heart stirred, restless and alive. He thought of the party, the faces, the voices, the strange beings that had drifted through their home like fragments of other worlds. He thought of how he had stood among them, hesitant at first, then slowly, carefully, stepping into conversations, into laughter, into moments that had seemed impossible for him. He remembered the warmth in his chest when someone had listened to him, really listened, as though his small voice carried weight. It was strange, he realized, how a single night could shift something inside. He was still Morty, still nervous, still awkward, still unsure of himself. But he also felt softer, braver, more willing to try. The memory of the night lived in him, not as noise, but as quiet proof that he could belong, even in places he never expected. Down the hall, Summer stirred in her room. Rick remained awake somewhere, muttering to himself as he tinkered with something unseen. Beth and Jerry slept, blissfully unaware, but Morty was caught in that liminal space, no longer in the party, not yet fully in sleep but suspended in reflection. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His room was familiar, posters on the walls, clothes strewn about, his schoolbooks stacked unevenly on the desk. Yet it felt different now, as though the very air carried more depth. He whispered to himself, almost shyly, "I think I'm different now." The thought scared him a little. Change always did, but it also comforted him. For so long he had felt like the smallest figure in the room, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who tagged along. That night had given him a glimpse of something else, not a grand transformation but a quiet opening. He remembered dancing, clumsy but real, and how no one laughed. He remembered asking questions, and how someone had answered with patience. He remembered standing beside Summer under the stars, and how the universe had felt both infinite and kind. These moments had stitched themselves into him, soft threads that he would carry forward. Morty lay back down, his hands resting on his chest. His heart beat steadily, a rhythm that reminded him he was alive and growing and learning. He thought of Rick, the way his grandfather had watched him with a strange tenderness, half hidden beneath sarcasm and drink. For a moment, Morty wondered if Rick had planned it all, if the party had been more than mischief. Maybe, just maybe, Rick had given him a gift without ever saying so. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that held memory rather than absence. Morty closed his eyes and imagined himself years from now, looking back on this night. He wondered if he would still feel the same warmth, the same soft courage. He hoped so. In the silence, a phrase came to him, simple and soothing. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. It was about Summer, about Rick, about everyone he had ever struggled to truly know. He realized then that understanding wasn't always about logic or clarity. Sometimes it was about presence, about staying close even when things didn't make sense. He smiled faintly in the dark. That too was part of his growth, learning to listen, learning to be patient, learning to bend without breaking. Outside his window, the night sky stretched endlessly. Stars glimmered softly, their light old and gentle. Morty felt small beneath them, but not insignificant. He was a part of it, in his own quiet way, and that realization soothed him more than words could. The hours passed slowly. Morty drifted closer to sleep, but his thoughts lingered on the lessons the night had left behind. He knew the world would not change for him. School would still be difficult, people would still be confusing, life would still be uncertain. But he had changed, even if only a little. And sometimes a little was enough. He whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible. "I think I'll be okay." The words floated into the room, gentle as a lullaby. Downstairs, Rick sat alone in the dim light of the garage, tools scattered around him. He heard Morty's faint voice, though he pretended not to. He took a long sip from his flask and muttered, "Yeah, kid, you will." His own heart ached, but he let the ache be. Growth, he knew, was never easy. But it was always real. The Smith home rested again. It no longer carried the noise of the party, but it held something deeper. The growth of a boy, the reflection of a girl, the silence of a grandfather who felt more than he admitted. It was a house, yes, but also a keeper of memory, of change, of quiet transformations too small for the world to see. Morty finally slipped into sleep. His breathing steadied, his body relaxed, his mind eased into dreams. But even in sleep the growth remained, tucked gently into his heart. The house too seemed to sigh in contentment, as though it knew it had done its part. And in the stillness the night stretched on, vast and unhurried. Somewhere in the silence a boy had grown, not loudly, not suddenly, but softly, like the steady bloom of dawn after the longest night. The house had long since surrendered to silence. Morty slept soundly in his room, his breath steady, his dreams light and untroubled. Summer, too, had drifted into sleep, her face turned toward the window as if she were still listening to the stars. Beth and Jerry lay in their bed, peaceful and unaware of the night that had transformed their home only hours before. But Rick was still awake. He sat on the back porch, a half-empty flask resting on the step beside him, his eyes fixed on the sky. The night stretched wide above him, dark and endless, yet tender in its stillness. The stars flickered like distant fires, each one carrying stories too vast to tell. Rick stared at them with a gaze both weary and longing, for a man who had crossed galaxies, who had seen suns born and extinguished, who had built and destroyed entire worlds. The sight of the stars should have been ordinary, yet tonight they felt different. Perhaps it was because the house behind him had lived through its own kind of universe, a single night that had held laughter, connection, and the quiet growth of two children who mattered more to him than he would ever say aloud. He took a long sip from the flask, the liquid burning just enough to remind him he was still here. His throat caught briefly, though whether from the drink or from something heavier, he couldn't quite tell. In the stillness he whispered, almost as though afraid to disturb the night, "You're growing up, Morty, and you too, Summer. Faster than you should have to." His voice trembled with something uncharacteristic, tenderness, maybe even love, though he quickly masked it with a soft chuckle. "But you're doing okay. Better than me." The words faded into the air, carried upward like smoke. Rick leaned back, resting his head against the porch railing. His mind drifted to the memory of the party, the surreal faces, the impossible colors, the way the house itself had seemed alive. He thought of Morty's hesitant smile, Summer's glow, the way the two of them had found courage in small, quiet ways. He thought of himself, too, watching from the sidelines with a heart that had ached more than he admitted. He whispered again, this time softer, almost like a lullaby. "You'll remember this night. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the faces, but you'll remember the feeling. And that's enough. Above him, the stars blinked as though in agreement. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle on him. He thought of all the times he had failed them, all the ways he had hidden his care beneath sarcasm and recklessness. He thought of how easily he could have ruined the night, how easily it all could have collapsed into chaos. But somehow it hadn't. Somehow the night had given Morty and Summer something he never could, a chance to see themselves differently, to grow quietly, without his interference. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh, almost like relief. "Guess I didn't screw it up this time," he murmured. The night deepened around him. Crickets sang their steady song, the air cool against his skin. The house behind him was utterly still, its walls no longer humming with memory but resting, holding those moments gently inside. Rick felt a strange comfort in that, the idea that the house itself was a witness, so that it would keep the secret safe even when no one spoke of it again. He picked up his flask once more, but instead of drinking, he set it aside. For once the stars were enough. He stared at them, letting their quiet light wash over him, letting the vastness remind him that even in a life filled with endless noise, there could be softness. A phrase rose unbidden to his lips, words he had once heard long ago, though he couldn't remember where. "The universe isn't always kind, but sometimes it is gentle." He repeated the words softly, as though testing them against the silence. They felt right, like a lullaby he might hum to himself in a rare, unguarded moment. Inside, Morty stirred slightly, his dreams brushing against the edges of memory. Summer shifted under her blanket, her breathing steady. Beth sighed in her sleep. Jerry muttered something unintelligible. The house held them all in its embrace, each one unaware of Rick's midnight vigil. Rick tilted his head back and whispered one last time, his voice barely audible. "I'm proud of you, kid. Both of you. Don't tell anyone I said that." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, sad and soft. He let the words vanish into the night, trusting the stars to keep them safe. The air grew colder, the sky darker still. Rick remained there, unmoving, watching, listening. The world around him exhaled slowly, a lullaby for a weary heart. And for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to simply sit, to simply be, not a scientist, not a wanderer, not a man running from his past. Just a grandfather, awake in the quiet, keeping watch over the people he loved. The house rested. The night rested. And somewhere between them, Rick's heart rested too, if only for a moment. The stars shimmered above him, steady and eternal. Rick's eyes closed at last, his head tilting back as though leaning into their light. A final whisper slipped from his lips, softer than a breath, more tender than he would ever admit in daylight. "Sleep well, kids. Everything's gonna be okay." And with that the night folded closed, as gentle as a song fading into silence.